Chapter 26 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J.M. Barrie. Chapter 26. Grizel all alone. It was Tommy who was the favorite of the gods, you remember, not Grizel. Elspeth wondered to see her after the publication of that book, looking much as usual. "You know how he loved you now," she said, perhaps a little reproachfully. "Yes," Grizel answered, "I know. I knew before the book came out." "You must be sorry for him." Grizel nodded. "But proud of him also," Elspeth said. "You have a right to be proud." "I am as proud," Grizel replied, "as I have a right to be." Something in her voice touched Elspeth, who was so happy that she wanted everyone to be happy. "I want you to know, Grizel," she said warmly, "that I don't blame you for not being able to love him. We can't help those things, nor need you blame yourself too much, for I've often heard him say that artists must suffer in order to produce beautiful things." But I cannot remember, Elspeth had to admit with a sigh to David, that she made any answer to that except "Thank you." Grizel was nearly as reticent to David himself. Once only did she break down for a moment in his presence. It was when he was telling her that the issue of the book had been stopped. "But I see you know already," he said. "Perhaps you even know why, though he has not given any sufficient reason to Elspeth." David had given his promise, she reminded him, not to ask her any questions about Tommy. "But I don't see why I should keep it," he said bluntly. "Because you dislike him," she replied. "Grizel," he declared, "I've tried hard to like him. I have thought and thought about it, and I can't see that he is giving me any just cause to dislike him." "And that," said Grizel, "makes you dislike him more than ever." "I know that you cared for him once," David persisted, "and I know that he wanted to marry you." But she would not let him go on. "David," she said, "I want to give up my house. I want you to take it. It is the real doctor's house of Thrums, and people in need of you still keep ringing me up at nights. The only door to your surgery is through my passage. It is I who should be in lodgings now." "Do you really think I would, Grizel?" he cried indignantly. "Rather than see the dear house go into another's hands," she answered steadily, "for I am determined to leave it. Dr. McQueen won't feel strange when he looks down, David, if it is only you he sees moving about the old rooms instead of me. You are doing this for me, Grizel, and I won't have it." "I give you my word," she told him, "that I am doing it for myself alone. I am tired of keeping a house and of all its worries. Men don't know what they are." She was smiling, but his brows wrinkled in pain. "Oh, Grizel," he said, and stopped. And then he cried, "Since when has Grizel ceased to care for housekeeping?" She did not say since when. I don't know whether she knew, but it was since she and Tommy had ceased to correspond. David's words showed her too suddenly how she had changed, and it was then that she broke down before him because she had ceased to care for housekeeping. But she had her way, and early in the new year David and his wife were established in their new home, with all Grizel's furniture, except such as was needed for the 2 rooms rented by her from Gavinia. She would have liked to take away the old doctor's chair, because it was the bit of him left behind when he died, and then, for that very reason, she did not. She no longer wanted him to see her always. "I am not so nice as I used to be, and I want to keep it from you," she said to the chair when she kissed it good-bye. Was Grizel not as nice as she used to be? How can I answer, who love her the more only? There is one, at least, Grizel, who will never desert you. Ah, but was she? I seem again to hear the warning voice of Grizel, and this time she is crying, "You know I was not." She knew it so well that she could say it to herself quite calmly. She knew that with whatever repugnance she drove those passions away, they would come back. Yes, and for a space be welcomed back. Why does she leave Gavinia's blue hearth this evening and seek the solitary den? She has gone to summon them, and she knows it. They come thick in the Den, for they know the place. It was there that her mother was wont to walk with them. "Have they been waiting for you in the Den, Grizel?" all this time? Have you found your mother's legacy at last?" Don't think that she sought them often. It was never when she seemed to have anything to live for. Tommy would not write to her, and so did not want her to write to him. But if that bowed her head, it never made her rebel. She still had her many duties. Whatever she suffered, so long as she could say, "I am helping him," she was in heart and soul the Grizel of old. In his fits of remorse, which were many, he tried to produce work that would please her. Thus, in a heroic attempt to be practical, he wrote a political article in one of the reviews, quite in the ordinary style, but so much worse than the average of such things that they would never have printed it without his name. He also contributed to a magazine a short tale, he who could never write tales, and he struck all the beautiful reflections out of it and never referred to himself once, and the result was so imbecile that kindly people said there must be another writer of the name. "Show them to Grizel," Tommy wrote to Elspeth, enclosing also some of the animadversions of the press, and he meant Grizel to see that he could write it in his own way only. But she read those two efforts with delight, and said to Elspeth, "Tell him I am so proud of them." Elspeth thought it very nice of Grizel to defend the despised in this way. Even Elspeth had fallen asleep over the political paper. She did not understand that Grizel loved them because they showed Tommy trying to do without his wings. Then another trifle by him appeared, shorter even than the others, but no man in England could have written it except T. Sandys. It has not been reprinted, and I forget everything about it except that its subject was love. Will not the friends of the man who can produce such a little masterpiece as this, the journal said, save him from wasting his time on lumber for the reviews and drivelling tales? And Tommy suggested to Elspeth that she might show Grizel this exhortation also. Grizel saw she was not helping him at all. If he would not fight, why should she? Oh, let her fall and fall. It would not take her farther from him. These were the thoughts that sent her into solitude to meet with worse ones. She could not face the morrow. What shall I do to-morrow? She never shrank from to-day. It had its duties. It could be got through, but to-morrow was a never-ending road. Oh, how could she get through to-morrow? Her great friend at this time was Corp, because he still retained his faith in Tommy. She could always talk of Tommy to Corp. How loyal Corp was. He still referred to Tommy as him. Gavinia, much distressed, read aloud to Corp a newspaper attack on the political article, and all he said was, "He'll find a way." "He's found it," he went upstairs to announce to Grizel when the praises of the little masterpiece arrived. "Yes, I know, Corp," she answered quietly. She was sitting by the window where the plant was. Tommy had asked her to take care of it without telling her why. Something in her appearance troubled the hulking, blundering man. He could not have told what it was. I think it was simply this, that Grizel no longer sat erect in her chair. "I'm nae easy in my mind about Grizel," he said that evening to Gavinia. "There's something queery about her, though I canna bottom 't." "Yea," said Gavinia, with mild contempt. He continued pulling at his pipe, grunting as if in pleasant pain, which was the way Corp smoked. "I could see she's no pleased, though he has found a wy," he said. "What pleasure should she be able to sook out o' his keeping ding-danging on about that woman?" retorted Gavinia. "What woman?" "The London besom that gae him the go-by." "Was there sich a woman?" Corp cried. "Of course there was, and it's her that he's aye writing about." "Havers, Gavinia, it's Grizel he's aye writing about, and it was Grizel that gae him the go-by. It's town talk." But whatever the town might say, Gavinia stuck to her opinion. "Grizel's no near so neat in her dressing as she was," she informed Corp, "and her hair's no aye tidy, and that bonnet she was in yesterday didna set her." "I've noticed it," cried Corp. "I've noticed it this while back, though I didna ken I had noticed it, Gavinia. I wonder what can be the reason." "It's because nobody cares," Gavinia replied sadly. "Trust one woman to know another." "We a care," said Corp stoutly. "We're as nothing, Corp, when he doesna care. She's fond o' him, man." "Of course she is in a wy. Whaur's the woman that could help it?" There's many a woman that could help it, said Gavinia tartly, for the honour of her sex, but she's no of them. To be candid, Gavinia was not one of them herself. I'm thinking she's terrible fond of him, she said, and I'm nae sure that he has treated her weel. Woman, take care, say a word agin him, and I'll middle you, Corp thundered, and she desisted in fear. But he made her reread the little essay to him in instalments, and at the end he said victoriously, "You blethering critter, there's no sich woman. It's just another o' his ploys." He marched upstairs to Grizel with the news, and she listened kindly. "I'm sure you are right," she said. "You understand him better than any one of them, Corp," and it was true. He thought he had settled the whole matter. He was burning to be downstairs to tell Gavinia that these things needed only a man. "And so you'll be yourself again, Grizel," he said with great relief. She had not seen that he was aiming at her until now, and it touched her. "Am I so different, Corp?" "Not at all," he assured her delicately, but she was maybe no quite so neatly dressed as she used to be, and her hair wasna braided back so smooth, and he did not think that bonnet quite set her. "Gavinia has been saying that to you." "I noticed it myself, Grizel. I'm a terrible noticer." "Perhaps you are right," she said, reflecting, after looking at herself for the first time for some days. "But to think of your caring, Corp." "I care most michty," he replied, with terrific earnestness. "I must try to satisfy you, then," she said, smiling. "But, Corp, please don't discuss me with Gavinia." This request embarrassed him, for soon again he did not know how to act. There was Grizel's strange behaviour with the child, for instance. "No, I won't come down to see him to-day, Corp," she had said. "Somehow children weary me." Such words from Grizel, his mouth would not shut, and he could say nothing. "Forgive, Corp," she cried remorsefully, and ran downstairs, and with many a passionate caress asked forgiveness of the child. Corp followed her, and for the moment he thought he must have been dreaming upstairs. "I wish I saw you wi' bairns o' your own, Grizel," he said, looking on entranced, but she gave him such a pitiful smile that he could not get it out of his head. Deprived of Gavinia's counsel and afraid to hurt Elspeth, he sought out the doctor and said bluntly to him, "How is it he never writes to Grizel? She misses him terrible." So David thought. Grizel's dejection is becoming common talk. "Damn him," he said in a gust of fury. But this was too much for loyal Corp. "Damn you," he roared. But in his heart he knew that the doctor was a just man, and henceforth, when he was meaning to comfort Grizel, he was often seeking comfort for himself. He did it all with elaborate cunning to prevent her guessing that he was disturbed about her. Asked permission to sit with her, for instance, because he was dull downstairs. Mentioned as a ludicrous thing that there were people who believed Tommy could treat a woman badly, and waited anxiously for the reply. Oh, he was transparent, was Corp, but you may be sure Grizel never let him know that she saw through him. Tommy could not be blamed, she pointed out, though he did not care for some woman who perhaps cared for him. "Exactly," said Corp. "And if he seemed," Grizel went on with momentary bitterness, "to treat her badly, it could be only because she had made herself cheap." "That's it," said Corp cheerfully. Then he added hurriedly, "No, that's no it at all. She's the last to mak herself cheap." Then he saw that this might put Grizel on the scent. "Of course there's no sic woman," he said artfully, "but if there was, he would make it a right. She mightna see how it was to be done, but kennin' what a critter he is, she maun be sure he would find a wy. She would never lose hope, Grizel." And then, if Grizel did not appease him instantly, he would say appealingly, "I canna think less o' him, Grizel. No, it would mak me just terrible low, Grizel," he would cry sternly. "Dinna tell me to think less o' that laddie." Then, when she had reassured him, he would recall the many instances in which Tommy, as a boy, had found a way. Did we ever ken he was finding it, Grizel, till he did find it? Many a time I says to myself, says I, all is over, and syne next minute that holy look comes over his face, and he stretches out his legs like as if he was riding on a horse, and all that kens him says, he has found a wy. If I was a woman, no, that there is such a woman, I would say to myself, he was never beat, I would say, when he was a laddie, and it's no likely he'll be beat when he's a mon. and I wouldn't sit looking at the fire with my hands fauded, nor would I forget to keep my hair neat, and I would wear the frock that set me best, and I would play in my old bonny wy wi' bairns, for, says I to myself, I'm sure to hae bairns o' my ain some day, and—" But Grizel cried, "Don't, Corp, don't." "I winna," he answered miserably. "No, I winna. Forgive me, Grizel, I think I'll be stepping." And then when he got as far as the door, he would say, "I cannot do it, Grizel. I'm just terrible way for the woman, if sich a woman there be, but I cannot think ill o' him. You mauna speir it o' me." He was much brightened by a reflection that came to him one day in church. Here have I been blaming him for no finding a why, and very like he doesna ken we want him to find a why. How to inform Tommy without letting Grizel know? She had tried twice long ago to teach him to write, but he found it harder on the wrist than the heaviest luggage. It was not safe for him even to think of the extra twirl that turned an N into an M, without first removing any knick-knacks that might be about. Nevertheless, he now proposed a third set to, and Grizel acquiesced, though she thought it but another of his inventions to keep her from brooding. The number of words in the English tongue excited him, and he often lost all by not confining the chase to one, like a dog after rabbits. Fortunately, he knew which words he wanted to bag. Change at Tilly Drum, tickets, show your tickets, and the like. He much enjoyed meeting in the flesh, so to speak. "Let's see, find a why, Grizel," he would say. "Ay, ay, and is that the critter?" And soon as the sly fellow could write it, or at least draw it. He affected an ambition to write a letter to his son on that gentleman's first birthday. "And so let's see what I send you these few scrapes is like, Grizel." She assured him that this is not essential in correspondence, but all the letters he had ever heard read aloud began thus, and he got his way. Anon Master Shiach was surprised and gratified to receive the following epistle. "My dear sir, I send you these few scrapes to tell you as you have found a way to be a year of age the morn. All tickets ready in which Gavinia joins, so no more at present I am, Sir, your obedient Father Corp Shiach." The fame of this letter went abroad, but not a soul knew of the next. It said, "My dear sir, I send you these few scrapes to tell you as Grizel needs cheering up. Kindly oblige by finding a way, so no more at present. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Corp Shiach." To his bewilderment, this produced no effect, though only because Tommy never got it, and he wrote again more sternly, requesting his hero to find a way immediately. He was waiting restlessly for the answer at a time when Elspeth called on Grizel to tell her of something beautiful that Tommy had done. He had been very ill for nearly a fortnight, it appeared, but had kept it from her to save her anxiety. Just think, Grizel, all the time he was in bed with bronchitis, he was writing me cheerful letters every other day, pretending there was nothing the matter with him. He is better now. I have heard about it from a Mrs. Jerry, a lady whom I knew in London, and who has nursed him in the kindest way. But this same Mrs. Jerry had opened Corp's letters and destroyed them as of no importance. He would never have mentioned it himself. How like him, Grizel! You remember I made him promise before he went back to London that if he was ill he would let me know at once, so that I could go to him. But he is so considerate he would not give me pain. He wrote those letters, Grizel, when he was gasping for breath. But she seemed quite unmoved, Elspeth said sadly to her husband afterwards. Unmoved? Yes. Grizel remained apparently unmoved until Elspeth had gone, but then the torture she endured. "Oh, cruel, cruel!" she cried, and she could neither stand nor sit. She flung herself down before the fire and rocked this way and that in a paroxysm of woe. "Oh, cruel, cruel!" It was Tommy who was cruel, to be ill, near to dying, apparently, and not to send her word. She could never, never have let him go, had he not made that promise to Elspeth, and he kept it thus. Oh, wicked, wicked! You would have gone to him at once, Elspeth. You, who are you that talks of going to him as your right? He is not yours, I tell you. He is mine. He is mine alone. It is I who would go to him. Who is this woman that dares take my place by his side when he is ill? She rose to go to him, to drive away all others. I am sure that was what gave her strength to rise, but she sank to the floor again, and her passion lasted for hours, and through the night she was crying to God that she would be brave no more. In her despair she hoped he heard her. Her mood had not changed when David came to see her next morning, to admit, too, that Tommy seemed to have done an unselfish thing in concealing his illness from them. Grizel nodded, but he thought she was looking strangely reckless. He had a message from Elspeth. Tommy had asked her to let him know whether the plant was flourishing. "So you and he don't correspond now?" David said, with his old puzzled look. "No," was all her answer to that. The plant, she thought, was dead. She had not, indeed, paid much attention to it of late, but she showed it to David, and he said it would revive if more carefully tended. He also told her its rather pathetic history, which was new to Grizel, and of the talk at the wedding, which had led to Tommy's taking pity on it. "Fellow feeling, I suppose," he said lightly. "You see, they both blossomed prematurely." The words were forgotten by him as soon as spoken, but Grizel sat on with them, for they were like a friend, or was it an enemy, who had come to tell her strange things. Yes, the doctor was right. Now she knew why Tommy had loved this plant, of the way in which he would sit looking wistfully at it, almost nursing it. She had been told by Aaron. He had himself begged her to tend it lovingly. Fellow feeling, the doctor was shrewder than he thought. Well, what did it matter to her? All that day she would do nothing for the plant, but in the middle of the night she rose and ran to it and hugged it, and for a time she was afraid to look at it by lamplight, lest Tommy was dead. Whether she had never been asleep that night or had awakened from a dream, she never knew, but she ran to the plant, thinking it and Tommy were as one, and that they must die together. No such thought had ever crossed his mind, but it seemed to her that she had been told it by him, and she lit her fire to give the plant warmth, and often desisted to press it to her bosom, the heat seemed to come so reluctantly from the fire. This idea that his fate was bound up with that of the plant took strange possession of the once practical Grizel. It was as if some of Tommy's nature had passed into her to help her break the terrible monotony of the days. And from that time there was no ailing child more passionately tended than the plant, and as spring advanced it began once more to put forth new leaves. And Grizel also seemed glorified again. She was her old self. Dark shapes still lingered for her in the den, but she avoided them, and if they tried to enter into her, she struggled with them and cast them out. As she saw herself able to fight and win once more, her pride returned to her, and one day she could ask David joyously to give her a present of the old doctor's chair, and she could kneel by its side and say to it, "You can watch me always. I am just as I used to be." Seeing her once more, the incarnation of vigour and content, singing gaily to his child, and as eager to be at her duties betimes as a morning in May, Corp grunted with delight, and was a hero for not telling her that it was he who had passed Tommy the word, for of course Tommy had done it all. "Somebody has found a why, Grizel," he would say, chuckling, and she smiled in agreement. "And yet," says he, puzzled, "I've watched and you hinna haen a letter frae him. It defies the face o' clay to find out how he has managed it. Oh, the crittur! I suppose you dinna want to tell me what it is that has lichted you up again." She could not tell him, for it was a compact she had made with one who did not sign it. "I shall cease to be bitter and despairing and wicked, and try every moment of my life to be good and do good, so long as my plant flourishes. But if it withers, then I shall go to him. I don't care what happens, I shall go to him." It was the middle of June when she first noticed that the plant was beginning to droop. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 27, Grizel's Journey. Nothing could have been less expected. In the beginning of May its leaves had lost something of their greenness. The plant seemed to be hesitating, but she coaxed it over the hill, and since then it had scarcely needed her hand. Almost light-headedly it hurried into its summer clothes, and new buds broke out on it like smiles, at the fascinating thought that there was to be a tomorrow. Grizel's plant had never been so brave in its little life when suddenly it turned back. That was the day on which Elspeth and David were leaving for a fortnight's holiday with his relatives by the sea. For Elspeth needed and was getting special devotion just now, and Grizel knew why. She was glad they were going. It was well that they should not be there to ask questions if she also must set forth on a journey. For more than a week she waited, and everything she could do for her plant she did. She watched it so carefully that she might have deceived herself into believing that it was standing still only, had there been no night time. She thought she had not perhaps been sufficiently good, and she tried to be more ostentatiously satisfied with her lot. Never had she forced herself to work quite so hard for others as in those few days, and then when she came home it had drooped a little more. When she was quite sure that it was dying, she told Corp she was going to London by that night's train. "He is ill, Corp, and I must go to him." Ill, but how had he let her know? "He has found a way," she said, with a tremulous smile. He wanted her to telegraph, but no, she would place no faith in telegrams. At least she could telegraph to Elspeth and the doctor. One of them would go. "It is I who am going," she said quietly. "I can't wait any longer. It was a promise, Corp. He loves me." They were the only words she said which suggest that there was anything strange about Grizel at this time. Corp saw how determined she was when she revealed incidentally that she had drawn a sum of money out of the bank a week ago, to be ready. "What will folk say?" he cried. "You can tell Gavinia the truth when I am gone," she told him. "She will know better than you what to say to other people." And that was some comfort to him, for it put the burden of invention upon his wife. So it was Corp who saw Grizel off. He was in great distress himself about Tommy, but he kept a courageous face for her. And his last words flung in at the carriage window were, "Now dinna be downhearted. I naen downhearted myself, for we're very sure he'll find a wy." And Grizel smiled and nodded, and the train turned the bend that shuts out the little town of Thrums. The town vanishes quickly, but the quarry we howked it out of stands grim and red, watching the train for many a mile. Of Grizel's journey to London there are no particulars to tell. She was wearing her brown jacket and her fur cap because Tommy had liked them, and she sat straight and stiff all the way. She had never been in the train since she was a baby, except 2 or 3 times to Tilliedrum, and she thought this was the right way to sit. Always, when the train stopped, which was at long intervals, she put her head out at the window and asked if this was the train to London. Every station a train stops at in the middle of the night is the infernal regions, and she shuddered to hear lost souls clanking their chains, which is what a milk can becomes on its way to the van. But still she asked if this was the train to London. When fellow passengers addressed her, she was very modest and cautious in her replies. Sometimes a look of extraordinary happiness, of radiance, passed over her face, and may have puzzled them. It was part of the thought that, however ill he might be, she was to see him now. She did not see him as soon as she expected, for at the door of Tommy's lodgings they told her that he had departed suddenly for the Continent about a week ago. He was to send an address by and by to which letters could be forwarded. Was he quite well when he went away? Grizel asked, shaking. The landlady and her daughter thought he was rather peakish, but he had not complained. He went away for his health, Grizel informed them, and he was very ill now. Oh, could they not tell her where he was? All she knew was that he was very ill. "I am engaged to be married to him," she said with dignity. Without this strange certainty that Tommy loved her at last, she could not have trod the road which faced her now. Even when she had left the house, where at their suggestion she was to call to-morrow, she found herself wondering at once what he would like her to do now, and she went straight to a hotel and had her box sent to it from the station, and she remained there all day because she thought that this was what he would like her to do. She sat bolt upright on a cane chair in her bedroom, praying to God with her eyes open. She was begging him to let Tommy tell her where he was, and promising to return home at once if he did not need her. Next morning they showed her at his lodgings 2 lines in a newspaper which said that he was ill with bronchitis at the Hotel Krone, Bad Platten, in Switzerland. It may have been an answer to her prayer, as she thought, but we know now how the paragraph got into print. On the previous evening the landlady had met Mr. Pym on the ladder of an omnibus, and told him, before they could be plucked apart, of the lady who knew that Mr. Sandys was ill. It must be bronchitis again. Pym was much troubled. He knew that the Krone at Bad Platten had been Tommy's destination. He talked that day, and one of the company was a reporter, which accounts for the paragraph. Grizel found out how she could get to Bad Platten. She left her box behind her at the cloakroom of the railway station, where I suppose it was sold years afterwards. From Dover she sent a telegram to Tommy, saying, "I am coming. Grizel." On entering the train at Calais, she had a railway journey of some 30 hours, broken by 2 changes only. She could speak a little French, but all the use she made of it was to ask repeatedly if she was in the right train. An English lady who travelled with her for many hours woke up now and again to notice that this quiet, prim-looking girl was always sitting erect, with her hand on her umbrella, as if ready to leave the train at any moment. The lady pointed out some of the beauties of the scenery to her, and Grizel tried to listen. "I am afraid you are unhappy," her companion said at last. "That is not why I am crying," Grizel said. "I think I am crying because I am so hungry." The stranger gave her sandwiches and claret, as cold as the rivers that raced the train, and Grizel told her quite frankly why she was going to Bad Platten. She did not tell his name, only that he was ill, and that she was engaged to him, and he had sent for her. She believed it all. The lady was very sympathetic, and gave her information about the diligence by which the last part of Grizel's journey must be made, and also said, "You must not neglect your meals, if only for his sake, for how can you nurse him back to health if you arrive at Bad Platten ill yourself? Consider his distress if he were to be told that you were in the inn, but not able to go to him." "Oh!" Grizel cried, rocking her arms for the first time since she knew her plant was drooping. She promised to be very practical henceforth, so as to have strength to take her place by his side at once. It was strange that she, who was so good a nurse, had forgotten these things, so strange that it alarmed her, as if she feared that, without being able to check herself, she was turning into some other person. The station where she alighted was in a hubbub of life. Everyone seemed to leave the train here, and to resent the presence of all the others. They were mostly English. The men hung back, as if, now that there was business to be done in some foolish tongue, they had better leave the ladies to do it. Many of them seemed prepared, if there was dissension, to disown their womankind and run for it. They looked haughty and nervous. Such of them as had tried to shave in the train were boasting of it and holding handkerchiefs to their chins. The ladies were moving about in a masterful way, carrying bunches of keys. When they had done everything, the men went and stood by their sides again. Outside the station, buses and carriages were innumerable, and everybody was shouting, but Grizel saw that nearly all her fellow passengers were hurrying by foot or conveyance to one spot. all desirous of being there first, and she thought it must be the place where the diligence started from and pressed on with them. It proved to be a hotel where they all wanted the best bedroom, and many of them had telegraphed for it, and they gathered round a man in uniform and demanded that room of him, but he treated them as if they were little dogs, and he was not the platter, and soon they were begging for a room on the 4th floor at the back, and swelling with triumph if they got it. The scrimmage was still going on when Grizel slipped out of the hotel, having learned that the diligence would not start until the following morning. It was still early in the afternoon. How could she wait until tomorrow? Bad Platten was 40 miles away. The road was pointed out to her. It began to climb at once. She was to discover that for more than 30 miles it never ceased to climb. She sat down, hesitating, on a little bridge that spanned a horrible, rushing white stream. Poets have sung the glories of that stream, but it sent a shiver through her. On all sides she was caged in by a ring of splendid mountains, but she did not give them one admiring glance. There is a special spot where the guide-books advise you to stop for a moment to do it. Her one passionate desire was to fling out her arms and knock them over. She had often walked 20 miles in a day, in a hill country too, without feeling tired, and there seemed no reason why she should not set off now. There were many inns on the way, she was told, where she could pass the night. There she could get the diligence next day. This would not bring her any sooner to him than if she waited here until tomorrow, but how could she sit still till tomorrow? She must be moving. She seemed to have been sitting still for an eternity. I must not do anything rash, she told herself carefully. I must arrive at Bad Platten, able to sit down beside him the moment I have taken off my jacket. Oh, without waiting to take off my jacket. She went into the hotel and ate some food just to show herself how careful she had become. About 3 o'clock she set off. She had a fierce desire to get away from that heartless white stream and the crack of whips and the doleful pine woods, and at first she walked very quickly. But she never got away from them, for they marched with her. It was not that day, but the next, that Grizel thought anything was marching with her. That day her head was quite clear, and she kept her promise to herself, and as soon as she felt tired she stopped for the night at a village inn. But when she awoke very early next morning, she seemed to have forgotten that she was to travel the rest of the way by diligence, for after a slight meal she started off again on foot, and she was walking all day. She passed through many villages, so like each other that in time she thought they might be the same. There was always a monster inn whence one carriage was departing as another drove up, and there was a great stone water tank in which women drew their washing back and forward, and there was always a big yellow dog that barked fiercely and then giggled, and at the doors of painted houses children stood. You knew they were children by their size only. The one person she spoke to that day was a child, who offered her a bunch of wild flowers. No one was looking, and Grizel kissed her and then hurried on. The carriage passed and repassed her. There must have been 100 of them, but in time they became one. No sooner had it disappeared in dust in front of her than she heard the crack of its whip behind. It was a glorious day of sweltering sun, but she was bewildered now, and did not open the umbrella with which she had shielded her head yesterday. In the foreground was always the same white road, on both sides the same pine wood laughing with wild flowers, the same roaring white stream. From somewhere near came the tinkle of cowbells. Far away on heights, if she looked up, were villages made of matchboxes. She saw what were surely the same villages if she looked down, or the one was the reflection of the other in the sky above or in the valley below. They stood out so vividly that they might have been within arm's reach. They were so small that she felt she could extinguish them with her umbrella. Near them was the detestably picturesque castle perched upon a bracket. Everywhere was that loathly waterfall. Here and there were squares of cultivated land that looked like doormats flung out upon the hillsides. The huge mountains raised their jagged heads through the snow, and were so sharp-edged that they might have been clipped out of cardboard. The sky was blue without a flaw, but lost clouds crawled like snakes between heaven and earth. All day the sun scorched her, but the night was nipping cold. From early morn till evening she climbed to get away from them, but they all marched with her. They waited while she slept. She woke up in an inn, and could have cried with delight, because she saw nothing but bare walls. But as soon as she reached the door, there they all were ready for her. An hour after she set off, she again reached that door, and she stopped at it to ask if this was the inn where she had passed the night. Everything had turned with her. 2 squalls of sudden rain drenched her that day, and she forced her way through the first, but sought a covering from the second. It was then afternoon, and she was passing through a village by a lake. Since Grizel's time, monster hotels have trampled the village to death, and the shuddering lake reflects all day the most hideous of caravansaries flung together as with a giant shovel in one of the loveliest spots on earth. Even then some of the hotels had found it out. Grizel drew near to 2 of them, and saw wet halls full of open umbrellas, which covered the floor and looked like great beetles. These buildings were too formidable, and she dragged herself past them. She came to a garden of hops and evergreens. Wet chairs were standing in the deserted walks, and here and there was a little arbour. She went into one of these arbours and sat down, and soon slid to the floor. The place was Saint-Jean, some miles from Bad Platten, but one of the umbrellas she had seen was Tommy's. Others belonged to Mrs. Jerry and Lady Pippinworth. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 28, 2 of them. When Tommy started impulsively on what proved to be his only continental trip, he had expected to join Mrs. Jerry and her stepdaughter at Bad Platten. They had been there for a fortnight, and the place is a dream, Mrs. Jerry had said in the letter pressing him to come, but it was at Saint-Jean that she met the diligence and told him to descend. Bad Platten, she explained, was a horror. Her fuller explanation was that she was becoming known there as the round lady. "Now, am I as round as all that?" she said plaintively to Tommy. "Mrs. Jerry," he replied with emotion, "you must not ask me what I think of you." He always treated her with extraordinary respect and chivalry now, and it awed her. She had looked too round because she was in the company of Lady Pippinworth. Everyone seemed to be too round or too large by the side of that gifted lady, who somehow never looked too thin. She knew her power. When there were women in the room whom she disliked, she merely went and stood beside them. In the gyrations of the dance, the onlooker would momentarily lose sight of her. She came and went like a blinking candle. Men could not dance with her without its being said that they were getting stout. There is nothing they dislike so much, yet they did dance with her. Tommy, having some slight reason, was particularly sensitive about references to his figure, yet it was Lady Pippinworth who had drawn him to Switzerland. What was her strange attraction? Calmly considered, she was preposterously thin, but men at least could not think merely of her thinness unless, when walking with her, they became fascinated by its shadow on the ground. She was tall, and had a very clear, pale complexion, and light brown hair. Light brown, too, were her heavy eyelashes, which were famous for being black-tipped, as if a brush had touched them, though it had not. She made play with her eyelashes as with a fan, and sometimes the upper and lower seemed to entangle for a moment and be in difficulties, from which you wanted to extricate them in the tenderest manner. And the more you wanted to help her, the more disdainfully she looked at you, yet, though she looked disdainful, she also looked helpless. Now we have the secret of her charm." This helpless disdain was the natural expression of her face, and I am sure she fell asleep with a curl of the lip. Her scorn of men so maddened them that they could not keep away from her. "Damn!" they said under their breath, and rushed to her. If rumour is to be believed, Sir Harry Pippinworth proposed to her in a fury brought on by the sneer with which she had surveyed his family portraits. I know nothing more of Sir Harry, except that she called him Pips, which seems to settle him. "They will be calling me the Round Gentleman," Tommy said ruefully to her that evening as he strolled with her towards the lake, and indeed he was looking stout. Mrs. Jerry did not accompany them. She wanted to be seen with her trying stepdaughter as little as possible, and Tommy's had been the happy proposal that he should attend them alternately. "Fling away my own figure to save yours," he had said gallantly to Mrs. Jerry. "Do you mind?" Lady Pippinworth asked. "I mind nothing," he replied, "so long as I am with you." He had not meant to begin so near the point where they had last left off. He had meant to begin much farther back, but an irresistible desire came over him to make sure that she really did permit him to say this sort of thing. Her only reply was a flutter of the little fans and a most contemptuous glance. "Alice," said Tommy in the old way. "Well?" "You don't understand what it is to me to say Alice again." "Many people call me Alice." "But they have a right to." "I supposed you thought you had a right to also." "No," said Tommy. "That is why I do it." She strolled on, more scornful and helpless than ever. Apparently it did not matter what one said to Lady Pippinworth. Her pout kept it within the proprieties. There was a magnificent sunset that evening, which dyed a snow-topped mountain pink. "That is what I came all the way from London to see," Tommy remarked, after they had gazed at it. "I hope you feel repaid," she said a little tartly. "You mistake my meaning," he replied. "I'd heard of these wonderful sunsets, and an intense desire came over me to see you looking disdainfully at them." "Yes, I feel amply repaid. Did you notice, Alice, or was it but a fancy of my own, that when he had seen the expression on your face the sun quite slunk away?" "I wonder you don't do so also," she retorted. She had no sense of humour, and was rather stupid, so it is no wonder that the men ran after her. "I am more gallant than the sun," said he. "If I had been up there in its place, Alice, and you had been looking at me, I could never have set." She pouted contemptuously, which meant, I think, that she was well pleased. Yet, though he seemed to be complimenting her, she was not sure of him. She had never been sure of Tommy, nor indeed he of her, which was probably why they were so interested in each other still. "Do you know," Tommy said, "what I have told you is really at least half the truth. If I did not come here to see you disdaining the sun, I think I did come to see you disdaining me. Odd, is it not, if true, that a man should travel so far to see a lip curl up?" "You don't seem to know what brought you," she said. "It seems so monstrous," he replied, musing. "Oh, yes, I am quite certain that the curl of the lip is responsible for my being here. It kept sending me constant telegrams. But what I want to know is, do I come for the pleasure of the thing or for the pain? Do I like your disdain, Alice, or does it make me writhe? Am I here to beg you to do it again, or to defy it?" "Which are you doing now?" she inquired. "I had hoped," he said with a sigh, "that you could tell me that." On another occasion they reached the same point in this discussion, and went a little beyond it. It was on a wet afternoon, too, when Tommy had vowed to himself to mend his ways. "That disdainful look is you," he told her, "and I admire it more than anything in nature. And yet, Alice, and yet—" "Well?" she answered coldly, but not moving, though he had come suddenly too near her. They were on a private verandah of the hotel, and she was lolling in a wicker chair. "And yet," he said intensely, "I am not certain that I would not give the world to have the power to drive that look from your face. That, I begin to think, is what brought me here." "But you are not sure?" she said with a shrug of the shoulder. It stung him into venturing further than he had ever gone with her before. Not too gently he took her head in both his hands and forced her to look up at him. She submitted without a protest. She was disdainful, but helpless. "Well?" she said again. He withdrew his hands, and she smiled mockingly. "If I thought—" he cried with sudden passion, and stopped. "You think a great deal, don't you?" she said. She was going now. "If I thought there was any blood in your veins, you icy woman." "Or in your own," said she, but she said it a little fiercely, and he noticed that. "Alice," he cried, "I know now. It is to drive that look from your face that I am here." She curtsied from the door. She was quite herself again. But for that moment she had been moved. He was convinced of it, and his first feeling was of exultation, as in an achievement. "I don't know what you are doing just now, Lady Pippinworth, but my compliments to you, and T. Sandys is swelling." There followed on this exultation another feeling as sincere, devout thankfulness that he had gone no further. He drew deep breaths of relief over his escape, but he knew that he had not himself to thank. His friends, the little sprites, had done it, in return for the amusement he seemed to give them. They had stayed him in the nick of time, but not earlier. It was quite as if they wanted Tommy to have his fun first. So often they had saved him from being spitted. How could he guess that the great catastrophe was fixed for to-night, and that henceforth they were to sit round him, counting his wriggles, as if this new treatment of him tickled them even more than the other? But he was too clever not to know that they might be fattening him for some very special feast, and his thanks took the form of a vow to need their help no more. To-morrow he would begin to climb the mountains around St. Gian. If he danced attendance on her dangerous ladyship again, Mrs. Jerry should be there also, and he would walk circumspectly between them, like a man with gyves upon his wrists. He was in the midst of all the details of these reforms when suddenly he looked at himself thus occupied, and laughed bitterly. He had so often come upon Tommy making grand resolves. He stopped operations and sat down beside them. No one could have wished more heartily to be anybody else, or have had less hope. He had not even the excuse of being passionately drawn to this woman. He remembered that she had never interested him until he heard of her effect upon other men. Her reputation as a duellist, whose defence none of his sex could pass, had led to his wondering what they saw in her, and he had dressed himself in their sentiments, and so approached her. There were times in her company when he forgot that he was wearing borrowed garments, when he went on flame, but he always knew, as now, upon reflection. Nothing seemed easier at this moment than to fling them aside. With one jerk they were on the floor. Obviously it was only vanity that had inspired him, and vanity was satisfied. The easier, therefore, to stop. "Would you like to make the woman unhappy, Tommy? You know you would not. You have somewhere about you one of the softest hearts in the world. Then desist. Be satisfied that you did thaw her once, and grateful that she so quickly froze again." "I am indeed, I am," he responds. "No one could have himself better in hand for the time being than I, and if a competition in morals were now going on, I should certainly take the medal. But I cannot speak for myself an hour in advance. I make a vow, as I have done so often before, but it does not help me to know what I may be at before the night is out." When his disgust with himself was at its height, he suddenly felt like a little god. His new book had come into view. He flicked a finger at his reflection in a mirror. "That for you," he said defiantly. "At least I can write. I can write at last." The manuscript lay almost finished at the bottom of his trunk. It could not easily have been stolen for 1 hour without his knowing. Just When he was about to start on a walk with one of the ladies, he would run upstairs to make sure that it was still there. He made sure by feeling, and would turn again at the door to make sure by looking. Miser never listened to the crispness of bank-notes with more avidity. Woman never spent more time in shutting and opening her jewel-box. I can write at last. He knew that, comparatively speaking, he had never been able to write before. He remembered the fuss that had been made about his former books. "Pooh," he said, addressing them contemptuously. Once more he drew his beloved manuscript from its hiding-place. He did not mean to read, only to fondle. But his eye chancing to fall on a special passage, 2 hours afterwards he was interrupted by the dinner-gong. He returned the pages to the box and wiped his eyes. While dressing hurriedly, he remembered with languid interest that Lady Pippinworth was staying in the same hotel. There were 100 or more at dinner, and they were all saying the same thing. "Where have you been to-day? Really? But the lower path is shadier. Is this your first visit? The glacier is very nice. Were you caught in the rain? The view from the top is very nice. After all, the rain lays the dust. They give you 2 sweets at Bad Platten and an ice on Sunday. The sunset is very nice. The poulet is very nice. The hotel is open during the summer months only, but probably the chairs in the dining-room and the knives and forks in their basket make these remarks to each other every evening throughout the winter." Being a newcomer, Tommy had not been placed beside either of his friends, who sat apart, because Mrs. Jerry said, "She calls me mamma, and I'm not going to stand that." For some time he gave thought to neither of them. He was engrossed in what he had been reading, and it turned him into a fine and magnanimous character. When gradually her ladyship began to flit among his reflections, it was not to disturb them, but because she harmonized. He wanted to apologize to her. The apology grew in grace as the dinner progressed. It was so charmingly composed that he was profoundly stirred by it. The opportunity came presently in the hall, where it is customary after dinner to lounge or stroll if you are afraid of the night air, or if you do not care for music, you can go into the drawing-room and listen to the piano. "I am sure mamma is looking for you everywhere," Lady Pippinworth said, when Tommy took a chair beside her. "It is her evening, you know." "Surely you would not drive me away," he replied with a languishing air, and then smiled at himself, for he was done with this sort of thing. "Lady Pippinworth," said he firmly, "it needs firmness when of late you have been saying Alice." "Well?" "I have been thinking," Tommy began. "I am sure you have," she said. "I have been thinking," he went on determinedly, "that I played a poor part this afternoon. I had no right to say what I said to you." "As far as I can remember," she answered, "you did not say very much." "It is like your generosity, Lady Pippinworth," he said, "to make light of it. And let us be frank. I made love to you." Anyone looking at his expressionless face and her lazy disdain, and there were many in the hall, would have guessed that their talk was of "Where were you to-day?" and "What should I do to-morrow?" "You don't really mean that?" her ladyship said incredulously. "Think, Mr. Sandys, before you tell me anything more. Are you sure you are not confusing me with mamma?" "I did it," said Tommy, remorsefully. "In my absence?" she asked. "When you were with me on the veranda." Her eyes opened to their widest, so surprised that the lashes had no time for their usual play. "Was that what you call making love, Mr. Sandys?" she inquired. "I call a spade a spade." "And now you are apologizing to me, I understand?" "If you can in the goodness of your heart forgive me, Lady Pippinworth." "Oh, I do," she said heartily, "I do. But how stupid you must have thought me not even to know. I feel that it is I who ought to apologize. What a number of ways there seem to be of making love, and yours is such an odd way." Now, to apologize for playing a poor part is one thing, and to put up with the charge of playing a part poorly is quite another. Nevertheless, he kept his temper. "You have discovered an excellent way of punishing me," he said manfully, "and I submit. Indeed, I admire you the more, so I am paying you a compliment when I whisper that I know you knew." But she would not have it. "You are so strangely dense to-night," she said. "Surely, if I had known, I would have stopped you. You forget that I am a married woman," she added, remembering Pip's rather late in the day. "There might be other reasons why you did not stop me," he replied impulsively. "Such as?" "Well, you might have wanted me to go on." He blurted it out. "So," said she, slowly, "you are apologizing to me for not going on?" "I implore you, Lady Pippinworth," Tommy said, in much distress, "not to think me capable of that. If I moved you for a moment, I am far from boasting of it. It makes me only the more anxious to do what is best for you." This was not the way it had shaped during dinner, and Tommy would have acted wisely had he now gone out to cool his head. "If you moved me," she repeated interrogatively, but with the best intentions. He continued to flounder. "Believe me," he implored her, "had I known it could be done, I should have checked myself. But they always insist that you are an iceberg, and am I so much to blame if that look of hauteur deceived me with the rest?" "Oh, dear Lady Disdain," he said warmly, in answer to one of her most freezing glances, "it deceives me no longer. From that moment I knew you had a heart, and I was shamed. As noble a heart as ever beat in woman," he added. He always tended to add generous bits when he found it coming out well. "Does the man think I am in love with him?" was Lady Disdain's inadequate reply. "No, no, indeed," he assured her earnestly. "I am not so vain as to think that, nor so selfish as to wish it. But if for a moment you were moved—" "But I was not," said she, stamping her shoe. His dander began to rise, as they say in the North, but he kept grip of politeness. "If you were moved for a moment, Lady Pippinworth," he went on, in a slightly more determined voice, "I am far from saying that it was so, but if—" "But as I was not," she said. It was no use putting things prettily to her when she snapped you up in this way. "You know you were," he said reproachfully. "I assure you," said she, "I don't know what you are talking about, but apparently it is something dreadful, so perhaps one of us ought to go away." As he did not take this hint, she opened a tattered Tauchnitz which was lying at her elbow. They are always lying at your elbow in a Swiss hotel, with the first pages missing. Tommy watched her gloomily. "This is unworthy of you," he said. "What is?" He was not quite sure, but as he sat there misgivings entered his mind and began to gnaw. Was it all a mistake of his? Undeniably he did think too much. After all, had she not been moved? 'Sdeath! His restlessness made her look up. "It must be a great load off your mind," she said with gentle laughter, "to know that your apology was unnecessary." "It is," Tommy said. "It is. 'Sdeath!" She resumed her book. So this was how one was rewarded for a generous impulse. He felt very bitter. So, he said inwardly. Also, very well, very well. Then he turned upon himself. "Serve you right," he said brutally. "Better stick to your books, Thomas, for you know nothing about women." To think for one moment that he had moved her, that streak of marble moved! He fell to watching her again as if she were some troublesome sentence that needed licking into shape. As she bent impertinently over her book, she was an insult to man. All Tommy's interest in her revived. She infuriated him. "Alice," he whispered. "Do keep quiet till I finish this chapter," she begged lazily. It brought him at once to the boiling point. "Alice!" he said fervently. She had noticed the change in his voice. "People are looking," she said, without moving a muscle. There was some subtle flattery to him in the warning, but he could not ask for more, for just then Mrs. Jerry came in. She was cloaked for the garden, and he had to go with her sulkily. At the door she observed that the ground was still wet. "Are you wearing your galoshes?" said he, brightening. "You must get them, Mrs. Jerry. I insist." She hesitated. Her room was on the third floor. "It is very good of you to be so thoughtful of me," she said. But I have no right to try to take care of you," he interposed in a melancholy voice. "It is true. Let us go." "I shan't be 2 minutes," said Mrs. Jerry in a flutter, and went off hastily for her goloshes, while he looked fondly after her. At the turn of the stairs she glanced back, and his eyes were still begging her to hurry. It was a gracious memory to her in the after years, for she never saw him again. As soon as she had gone, he returned to the hall, and taking from a peg a cloak with a mother goose hood, brought it to Lady Pippinworth, who had watched her mamma trip upstairs. "Did I say I was going out?" she asked. "Yes," said Tommy, and she rose to let him put the elegant thing round her. She was one of those dangerous women who look their best when you are helping them to put on their cloaks. "Now," he instructed her, "pull the hood over your head." "Is it so cold as that?" she said, obeying. "I want you to wear it," he answered. What he meant was that she never looked quite so impudent as in her hood, and his vanity insisted that she should be armed to the teeth before they resumed hostilities. The red light was in his eyes as he drew her into the garden where Grizel lay. End of chapter 28.
Chapter 29 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Franziska Powell. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. The Red Light. It was an evening without stars, but fair, sufficient wind to make her ladyship cling haughtily to his arms as they turned corners. Many of the visitors were in the garden, some grouped around the quartet of gaily attired minstrels, but more sitting in little arbours or prowling in search of an arbour to sit in. The night was so dark that when our two passed beyond the light of the hotel windows, they could scarce see the shrubs they brushed against. Cigars without faces behind them sauntered past. Several times they thought they had found an unoccupied arbour at last, when they heard the clink of coffee cups. "I believe the castle dates from the 15th century," Tommy would then say sullenly, though it was not of castles he had been talking. With a certain satisfaction he noticed that she permitted him, without comment, to bring in the castle dust, and to drop it the moment the emergency had passed. But he had little other encouragement. Even when she pressed his arm, it was only as an intimation that the castle was needed. "I can't even make her angry," he said wrathfully to himself. "You answer not a word," he said in great dejection to her. "I'm afraid to speak," she admitted. "I don't know who may hear." "Alice," he said eagerly, "what would you say if we were not afraid to speak?" They had stopped, and he thought she trembled a little on his arm, but he could not be sure. He thought, but he was thinking too much again. At least Lady Pippinworth seemed to come to that conclusion, for with a galling little laugh she moved on. He saw with amazing clearness that he had thought sufficiently for one day. On coming into the garden with her, and for some time afterwards, he had been studying her so coolly, watching symptoms rather than words, that there is nothing to compare the man but a doctor who, while he is chatting, has his finger on your pulse. But he was not so calm now. Whether or not he had stirred the woman, he was rapidly firing himself. When next he saw her face by the light of a window, she at the same instant turned her eyes on him. It was as if each wanted to know correctly how the other had been looking in the darkness, and the effect was a challenge. Like one retreating a step, she lowered her eyes. "I am tired," she said. "I shall go in." "Let us stroll round once more." "No, I am going in." "If you are afraid," he said with a slight smile. She took his arm again. "Though it is too bad for me to keep you out," she said as they went on, "for you are shivering." "Is it the night air that makes you shiver?" she asked mockingly. But she shivered a little herself, as if with a presentiment that she might be less defiant if he were less thoughtful. For a month or so she had burned to teach him a lesson, but there was a time before that when, Had she been sure he was in earnest, she would have preferred to be the pupil. Two ladies came out of an arbour where they had been drinking coffee, and sauntered towards the hotel. It was a tiny building, half concealed in hops and reached by 3 steps, and Tommy and his companion took possession. He groped in the darkness for a chair for her, and invited her tenderly to sit down. She said she preferred to stand. She was by the open window, her fingers drumming on the sill. Though he could not see her face, he knew exactly how she was looking. "Sit down," he said, rather masterfully. "I prefer to stand," she repeated languidly. He had a passionate desire to take her by the shoulders, but put his hand on hers instead, and she permitted it, like one disdainful but helpless. She said something unimportant about the stillness. "Is it so still?" he said in a low voice. "I seem to hear a great noise. I think it must be the beating of my heart." "I fancy that is what it is," she drawled. "Do you hear it?" "No." "Did you ever hear your own heart beat, Alice?" "No." He had both her hands now. "Would you like to hear it?" She pulled away her hands sharply. "Yes," she replied with defiance. "But you pulled away your hands first," said he. He heard her breathe heavily for a moment, but she said nothing. "Yes," he said, as if she had spoken. "It is true." "What is true?" "What you were saying to yourself just now, that you hate me." She beat the floor with her foot. "How you hate me, Alice." "Oh, no." "Yes, indeed you do." "I wonder why," she said, and she trembled a little. "I know why." He had come close to her again. "Shall I tell you why?" she said. "No," hurriedly. "I'm so glad you say no." He spoke passionately, and yet there was banter in his voice, or so it seemed to her. "It is because you fear to be told. It is because you had hoped that I did not know." "Tell me why I hate you," she cried. "Tell me first that you do." "Oh, I do indeed." She said the words in a white beat of hatred. Before she could prevent him, he had raised her hands to his lips. "Dear Alice," he said. "Why is it?" she demanded. "Listen," he said. "Listen to your heart, Alice. It is beating now. It is telling you why. Does it need an interpreter? It is saying you hate me because you think I don't love you." "Don't you?" she asked fiercely. "No," Tommy said. Her hands were tearing at each other, and she could not trust herself to speak. She sat down deadly pale in the chair he had offered her. "No man ever loved you," he said, leaning over her with his hand on the back of the chair. "You are smiling at that, I know, but it is true, Lady Disdain. They may have vowed to blow their brains out, and seldom did it. They may have let you walk over them, and they may have become your fetch and carry, for you were always able to drive them crazy. But love does not bring men so low. They tried hard to love you, and it was not that they could not love, it was that you were unlovable. That is a terrible thing to a woman. You think you led them to try to love you, that you might make them your slaves when they succeeded, but you made them your slaves because they failed. It is a power given to your cold and selfish nature in place of the capacity for being able to be loved, with which women not hundreds past as beautiful as you are dowered. And you have a raging desire, Alice, to exercise it over me as over the others, but you can't." Had he seen her face then, it might have warned him to take care, but he heard her words only, and they were not at all in keeping with her face. "I see I can't," was what she cried, almost in a whisper. "It is all true, Alice, is it not?" "I suppose so. I don't know. I don't care." She swung around in her chair and caught his sleeve. Her hands clung to it. "Say you love me now," she said. "I cannot live without your love after this. What shall I do to make you love me? Tell me, and I will do it." He could not stop himself, for he mistrusted her still. "I will not be your slave," he said through his teeth. "You shall be mine. Yes, yes. You shall submit to me in everything. If I say come, you shall come, to wheresoever it may be. And if I say stay, and leave you forever, you shall stay." "Very well," she said eagerly. She would have her revenge when he was her slave. You can continue to be the haughty Lady Disdain to others, but you shall be only obedient little Alice to me. Very well. She drew his arm around her and pressed her lips upon it. And for that you will love me a little, won't you? You will love me at last, won't you? She entreated. He was a masterful man up to a certain point only. Her humility now trapped him in a new place, and before he knew what he was about he began to run pity. To humiliate you so, Alice. I am a dastard. I am not such a dastard as you think me. I wanted to know that you would be willing to do all these things, but I would never have let you do them. I am willing to do them. No, no. It was he who had her hands now. It was brutal, but I did it for you, Alice, for you. Don't you see I was doing it only to make a woman of you? You were always adorable, but in that coat of mail that would let love neither in nor out. I have been hammering at it to break it only and free my glorious Alice. We had to fight, and one of us had to give in. You would have flung me away if I had yielded. I had to win to save you. Now I am lost indeed, he was saying to himself, even as it came rushing out of him, and what appalled him most was that worse had probably still to come. He was astride two horses, and both were at the gallop. He flung out his arms as if seeking for something to check him. As he did so, she had started to her feet, listening. It seemed to her that there was someone near them. He flung out his arms for help, and they fell upon Lady Pippinworth and went round her. He drew her to him. She could hear no breathing now but his. Alice, I love you, for you are love itself. It is you I have been chasing since first love rose like a bird at my feet. I never had a passing fancy for any other woman. I always knew that somewhere in the world there must be you, and sometime the starless night and you for me. You were hidden behind walls of ice. No man had passed them. I broke them down, and love leaped to love. And you lie here, my beautiful, love in the arms of its lover. He was in a frenzy of passion now. He meant every word of it, and her intention was to turn upon him presently and mock him, this man with whom she had been playing. Oh, the jeering things she had to say! But she could not say them yet. She would give a fool another moment. So she thought, but she was giving it to herself, and as she delayed, she was in danger of melting in his arms. What does the world look like to you, my darling? You are in it for the first time. You were born but a moment ago. It is dark, that you may not be blinded before you have used your eyes. These are your eyes, dear eyes, that do not yet know their purpose. They are for looking at me, little Alice, and mine are for looking into yours. I cannot see you. I have never seen the face of my love. Oh, my love, come into the light that I may see your face. They did not move. Her head had fallen on his shoulder. She was to give it but a moment, and then... But the moment had passed, and still her hair pressed his cheek. Her eyes were closed. He seemed to have found the way to woo her. Neither of them spoke. Suddenly they jumped apart. Lady Pippinworth stole to the door. They held their breath and listened. It was not so loud now, but it was distinctly heard. It had been heavy breathing, and now she was trying to check it and half succeeding, but at a cost of little cries. They both knew it was a woman, and she was in the arbor, on the other side of the little table. She must have been there when they came in. Who is that? There was no answer to him, save the checked breathing and another broken cry. She moved, and it helped him to see vaguely the outlines of a girl who seemed to be drawing back from him in terror. He thought she was crouching now in the farthest corner. "Come away," he said. But Lady Pippinworth would not let him go. They must know who this woman was. He remembered that a match-stand usually lay on the table of those arbors, and groped until he found one. "Who are you?" He struck a match. They were those French matches that play an infernal interlude before beginning to burn. While he waited, he knew she was begging him, with her hands and with cries that were too little to be words, not to turn his lights on her. But he did. And then she ceased to cover. The girlish dignity that had been hers so long came running back to her, and she faced him. There was even a crooked smile upon her face. "I woke up," she said, as if the words had no meaning to herself. but might have some to him. The match burned out before he spoke, but his face was terrible. "Grizel," he said, appalled, and then, as if the discovery was as awful to her as to him, she uttered a cry of horror and sped out into the night. He called her name again and sprang after her, but the hand of another woman detained him. "Who is this girl?" Lady Pippinworth demanded fiercely, but he did not answer. He recoiled from her with a shudder that she was not likely to forget, and hurried on. All that night he searched for Grizel in vain. End of The Red Light. Recording by Franziska Paul.
Chapter 30 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 30. The Little Gods Desert Him. And all next day he searched like a man whose eyes would never close again. She had not passed the night in any inn or village house of St. Gian. Of that he made certain by inquiries from door to door. None of the guides had seen her, though they are astir so late and so early, patiently waiting at the hotel doors to be hired, that there seems to be no night for them, darkness only, that blots them out for a time as they stand waiting. At all hours there is in St. Gian the tinkle of bells, the clatter of hoofs, the crack of a whip, dust in retreat, but no coachman brought him news. The streets were thronged with other coachmen on foot, looking into every face in quest of some person who wanted to return to the lowlands, but none had looked into her face. Within 5 minutes of the hotel she might have been on any of half a dozen roads. He wandered or rushed along them all for a space, and came back. One of them was short and ended in the lake. All through that long and beautiful day this miserable man found himself coming back to the road that ended in the lake. There were moments when he cried to himself that it was an apparition he had seen and heard. He had avoided his friends all day. Of the English-speaking people in St. Gian, one only knew why he was distraught, and she was the last he wished to speak to. But more than once he nearly sought her to say, "Partner in my shame, what did you see? What did you hear?" In the afternoon he had a letter from Elspeth telling him how she was enjoying her holiday by the sea, and mentioning that David was at that moment writing to Grizel in Thrums. But was it then all a dream? He cried, nearly convinced for the first time, and he went into the arbour, saying determinedly that it was a dream. And in the arbour, standing primly in a corner, was Grizel's umbrella. He knew that umbrella so well. He remembered once being by while she replaced one of its ribs so deftly that he seemed to be looking on at a surgical operation. The old doctor had given it to her, and that was why she would not let it grow old before she was old herself. Tommy opened it now with trembling hands and looked at the little bits of Grizel on it, the beautiful stitching with which she had coaxed the slits to close again, the one patch so artful that she had clapped her hands over it, and he fell on his knees and kissed these little bits of Grizel and called her beloved, and cried to his gods to give him one more chance. "I woke up." It was all that she had said. It was Grizel's excuse for inconveniencing him. She had said it apologetically, and as if she did not quite know how she came to be there herself. There was no look of reproach on her face while the match burned. There had been a pitiful smile, as if she was begging him not to be very angry with her, and then when he said her name she gave that little cry, as if she had recognized herself, and stole away. He lived that moment over and over again, and she never seemed to be horror-stricken until he cried "Grizel," when her recognition of herself made her scream. It was as if she had wakened up, dazed by the terrible things that were being said, and then by the light of that one word Grizel suddenly knew who had been listening to them. Did he know anything more? He pressed his hands harshly on his temples and thought. He knew that she was soaking wet, that she had probably sought the arbour for protection from the rain, and that, if so, she had been there for at least 4 hours. She had wakened up. She must have fallen asleep, knocked down by fatigue. What fatigue it must have been to make Grizel lie there for hours he could guess, and he beat his brow in anguish. But why she had come he could not guess. "Oh, miserable man, to seek for reasons!" he cried passionately to himself, "when it is Grizel, Grizel herself, you should be seeking for." He walked and ran the round of the lake, and it was not on the bank that his staring eyes were fixed. At last he came for a moment upon her track. The people of an inn 6 miles from St. Gian remembered being asked yesterday by an English miss, walking alone, how far she was from Bad Platten. She was wearing something brown, and her boots were white with dust, and these people had never seen a lady look so tired before. When she stood still, she had to lean against the wall. They said she had red-hot eyes. Tommy was in an Einspanner now, the merry conveyance of the country, and more intoxicating than its wines, and he drove back through St. Gian to Bad Platten, where again he heard from Grizel, though he did not find her. What he found was her telegram from London: "I am coming, Grizel." Why had she come? Why had she sent that telegram? What had taken her to London? He was not losing time when he asked himself distractedly these questions, for he was again in his gay carriage and driving back to the wayside inn. He spent the night there, afraid to go farther lest he should pass her in the darkness, for he had decided that, if alive, she was on this road. That she had walked all those 40 miles uphill seemed certain, and apparently the best he could hope was that she was walking back. She had probably no money to enable her to take the diligence. Perhaps she had no money with which to buy food. It might be that while he lay tossing in bed, she was somewhere near dying for want of a franc. He was off by morning light, and several times that day he heard of her, twice from people who had seen her pass, both going and coming, and he knew it must be she when they said she rocked her arms as she walked. Oh, he knew why she rocked her arms. Once he thought he had found her. He heard of an English lady who was lying ill in the house of a sawmiller, whose dog — we know the dogs of these regions, but not the people — had found her prostrate in the wood some distance from the high road. Leaving his Einsperner in a village, Tommy climbed down the mountainside to this little house, which he was long in discovering. It was by the side of a roaring river, and he arrived only an hour too late. The lady had certainly been Grizel, but she was gone. The sawyer's wife described to him how her husband had brought her in, and how she seemed so tired and bewildered that she fell asleep while they were questioning her. She held her hands over her ears to shut out the noise of the river, which seemed to terrify her. So far as they could understand, she told them that she was running away from the river. She had been sleeping there for 3 hours, and was still asleep when the good woman went off to meet her husband, but when they returned she was gone. He searched the wood for miles around, crying her name. The sawyer and some of his fellow workers left the trees they were stripping of bark to help him, and for hours the wood rang with Grizel, Grizel. All the mountains round took up the cry, but there never came an answer. This long delay prevented his reaching the railway terminus until noon of the following day, and there he was again too late. But she had been here. He traced her to that hotel whence we saw her setting forth, and the portier had got a ticket for her for London. He had talked with her for some little time, and advised her, as she seemed so tired, to remain there for the night, but she said she must go home at once. She seemed to be passionately desirous to go home, and had looked at him suspiciously, as if fearing he might try to hold her back. He had been called away, and on returning had seen her disappearing over the bridge. He had called to her, and then she ran, as if afraid he was pursuing her, but he had observed her afterwards in the train. So she was not without money, and she was on her way home. The relief it brought him came to the surface in great breaths, and at first every one of them was a prayer of thankfulness. Yet in time they were triumphant breaths. Translated into words, they said that he had got off cheaply for the 100th time. His little gods had saved him again, as they had saved him in the arbour by sending Grizel to him. He could do as he liked, for they were always there to succour him. They would never desert him, never. In a moment of fierce elation he raised his hat to them, then seemed to see Grizel crying. I woke up, and in horror of himself clapped it on again. It was but a momentary aberration, and is recorded only to show that, however remorseful he felt afterwards, there was life in our Tommy still. The train by which he was to follow her did not leave until evening, and through those long hours he was picturing, with horrible vividness and pain, the progress of Grizel up and down that terrible pass. Often his shoulders shook in agony over what he saw, and he shuddered to the teeth. He would have walked round the world on his knees to save her this long anguish. And then again it was less something he saw than something he was writing, and he altered it to make it more dramatic. I woke up. How awful that was! But in this new scene she uttered no words. Lady Pippinworth was in his arms when they heard a little cry, so faint that a violin string makes as much moan when it snaps. In a dread silence he lit a match, and as it flared the figure of a girl was seen upon the floor. She was dead, and even as he knew that she was dead, he recognized her. "Grizel!" he cried. The other woman who had lured him from his true love uttered a piercing scream and ran towards the hotel. When she returned with men and lanterns, there was no one in the arbour, but there were what had been a man and a girl. They lay side by side. The startled onlookers unbared their heads. A solemn voice said, "In death not divided." He was not the only occupant of the hotel reading-room as he saw all this, and when his head fell forward and he groaned, the others looked up from their papers. A lady asked if he was unwell. "I have had a great shock," he replied in a daze, pulling his hand across his forehead. "Something you have seen in your paper?" inquired a clergyman who had been complaining that there was no news. "People I knew," said Tommy, not yet certain which world he was in. "Dead?" the lady asked sympathetically. "I knew them well," he said, and staggered into the fresh air. Poor dog of a Tommy! He had been a total abstainer from sentiment, as one may say, for 60 hours, and this was his only glass. It was the nobler Tommy, sternly facing facts, who by and by stepped into the train. He even knew why he was going to Thrums. He was going to say certain things to her, and he said them to himself again and again in the train, and heard her answer. The words might vary, but they were always to the same effect. "Grizel, I have come back." He saw himself say these words as he opened her door in Gavinia's little house, and when he had said them he bowed his head. At his sudden appearance she started up, then she stood pale and firm. "Why have you come back?" "Not to ask your forgiveness," he replied hoarsely, "not to attempt to excuse myself, not with any hope that there remains one drop of the love you once gave me so abundantly. I want only, Grizel, to put my life into your hands. I have made a sorry mess of it myself. Will you take charge of what may be left of it? You always said you were ready to help me. I have come back, Grizel, for your help. What you were once willing to do for love, will you do for pity now?" She turned away her head, and he went nearer her. "There was always something of the mother in your love, Grizel. But for that you would never have borne with me so long. A mother, they say, can never quite forget her boy. Oh, Grizel, is it true? I am the prodigal come back. Grizel, beloved, I have sinned, and I am unworthy, but I am still your boy, and I have come back. Am I to be sent away?" At the word beloved, her arms rocked impulsively. "You must not call me that," she said. "Then I am to go," he answered with a shudder, "for I must always call you that. Whether I am with you or away, you shall always be beloved to me." "You don't love me!" she cried. "Oh, do you love me at last?" And at that he fell upon his knees. "Grizel, my love, my love!" "But you don't want to be married," she said. "Beloved, I have come back to ask you on my knees to be my wife." That woman! She was a married woman, Grizel. Oh, oh, oh! And now you know the worst of me. It is the whole truth at last. I don't know why you took that terrible journey, dear Grizel, but I do know that you were sent there to save me. Oh, my love, you have done so much. Will you do no more? And so on, till there came a time when his head was on her lap and her hand caressing it, and she was whispering to her boy to look up and see her crooked smile again. He passed on to the wedding. All the time between seemed to be spent in his fond entreaties to hasten the longed-for day. How radiant she looked in her bridal gown! Oh, beautiful one, are you really mine? Oh, world, pause for a moment and look at the woman who has given herself to me. My wife, this is my wife. They were in London now. He was showing her to London. How he swaggered! There was a perpetual apology on her face. It begged people to excuse him for looking so proudly at her. It was a crooked apology, and he hurried her into dark places and kissed it. Do you see that Tommy was doing all this for Grizel and pretending to her that it was for himself? He was passionately desirous of making amends, and he was to do it in the most generous way. Perhaps he believed when he seemed to enter her room saying, "Grizel, I have come back," that she loved him still. Perhaps he knew that he did not love in the way he said. Perhaps he saw a remorseful man making splendid atonement. But never should she know these things. Tenderly as he had begun, he would go on to the end. Here at last is a Tommy worth looking at, and he looked. Yet as he drew near Thrums, after almost exactly 2 days of continuous travel, many a shiver went down his back, for he could not be sure that he should find Grizel here. He sometimes seemed to see her lying ill at some wayside station in Switzerland, in France. Everything that could have happened to her he conceived, and he moved restlessly in the carriage. His mouth went dry. Has she come back? The train had stopped for the taking of tickets, and his tremulous question checked the joy of Corp at sight of him. "She's back," Corp answered in an excited whisper, and oh, the relief to Tommy. "She came back by the afternoon train, but I had scarce a word wi' her. She was so awid to be hame. I am going home," she cried, and hurried away up the brae. "Ay, and there's one queer thing." "What?" "Her luggage wasna in the van." Tommy could smile at that. "But what sent her," he asked eagerly, "on that journey?" Corp told him the little he knew. "But nobody kens except me and Gavinia," he said. "We pretend she gaed to London to see her father. We said he had wrote to her wanting her to go to him. Gavinia said it would never do to let folk ken she had gane to see you, and even Elspeth doesna ken." "Is Elspeth back?" "They came back yesterday." Did David know the truth from Grizel? Was what Tommy was asking himself now as he strode up the brae. But again he was in luck, for when he had explained away his abrupt return to Elspeth and been joyfully welcomed by her, she told him that her husband had been in one of the glens all day. "He does not know that Grizel has come back," she said. "Oh!" she exclaimed, "but you don't even know that she has been away. Grizel has been in London." "Corp told me," said Tommy. "And did he tell you why she had gone?" "Yes. She came back an hour or two ago. Maggie Ann saw her go past. Fancy her seeing her father at last. It must have been an ordeal for her. I wonder what took place." "I think I had better go and ask her," Tommy said. He was mightily relieved for Grizel's sake. No one need ever know now what had called her away except Corp and Gavinia, and even they thought that she had merely been to London. How well the little gods were managing the whole affair! As he walked to Grizel's lodgings to say what he had been saying in the train, the thought came to him for a moment that as no one need ever know where she had been, there was less reason why he should do this generous thing. But he put it from him with lofty disdain. Any effect it had was to make him walk more firmly to his sacrifice, as if to show all ignoble impulses that they could find no home in that swelling breast. He was pleased with himself, was Tommy. "Grizel, I have come back." He said it to the night, and bowed his head. He said it with head accompaniment to Grizel's lighted window. He said it to himself as he reached the door. He never said it again. For Gavinia's first words were, "It's you, Mr. Sandys. Wherever is she? For mercy's sake, dinna say you've come without her." And when he blinked at this, she took him roughly by the arm and cried, "Wherever's Grizel?" "She is here, Gavinia." "She's no here." "I saw her light." "You saw my light." "Gavinia, you are torturing me. She came back to-day." "What makes you say that? You're dreaming. She hasna come back." Corp saw her come in by the afternoon train. He spoke to her. Gavinia shook her head incredulously. "You're just imagining that," she said. "He told me. Gavinia, I must see for myself." She stared after him as he went up the stairs. "You are very cruel, Gavinia," he said when he came down. "Tell me where she is." "May I be struck, Mr. Sandys, if I've seen or heard o' her since she left this house 8 days syne." He knew she was speaking the truth. He had to lean against the door for support. "It canna be so bad as you think," she cried in pity. "If you're sure Corp said he saw her, she maun hae gone to the doctor's house." "She is not there." But Elspeth knew she had come back. Others have seen her besides Corp. My God, Gavinia, what can have happened? In little more than an hour he knew what had happened. Many besides himself, David among them towards the end, were engaged in the search, and strange stories began to fly about like night birds. You will not search for a missing woman without rousing them. Why had she gone off to London without telling anyone? Had Corp concocted that story about her father to blind them? Had she really been as far as London? "Have you seen Sandys? He's back." It said Corp telegraphed to him to Switzerland that she had disappeared. It's weel Kent Corp telegraphed. Sandys came at once. He is in a terrible state. Look how white he is aneath that lamp. What garred them telegraph for him? How is it he is in sich a state? Fond o' her, was he? Yea, even after she gave him the go-by. Then it's a weary Sabbath for him, if half they say be true. What do they say? They say she was queer when she came back. Corp doesna say that. Maybe no, but Francie Crabb does. He says he met her on the station brae and spoke to her, and she said never a word, but put up her hands like as if she feared he was to strike her. The Dundas lassies saw her frae their window, and her hands were at her ears, as if she were trying to drown the sound of something. Do you mind her mother? They say she was looking terrible like her mother. It was only between the station and Gavinia's house that she had been seen, but they searched far afield. Tommy, accompanied by Corp, even sought for her in the Den. Do you remember the long, lonely path between two ragged little dykes that led from the Den to the house of the Painted Lady? It was there that Grizel had lived with her mamma. The two men went down that path, which is oppressed with trees. Elsewhere the night was not dark, but as they had known so well when they were boys, it is always dark after evenfall in the double dykes. That is the legacy of the Painted Lady. Presently they saw the house, scarcely the house, but a lighted window. Tommy remembered the night when, as a boy, Elspeth, crouching beside him, he had peered in fearfully at that corner window on Grizel and her mamma, and the shuddersome things he had seen. He shuddered at them again. "Who lives there now?" he asked. "Nobody. It's toom." "There is a light." "Some going about body. They often tak bilby in toom houses, and that door is without a lock. It's keep it close with slipping a stick aneath it. Do you mind how feared we used to be at that house?" She was never afraid of it. It was her hame. He meant no more than he said, but suddenly they both stopped dead. "It's no possible," Corp said, as if in answer to a question. "It's no possible," he repeated beseechingly. "Wait for me here, Corp. I would rather come wi' you." "Wait here," Tommy said almost fiercely, and he went on alone to that little window. It had needed an effort to make him look in when he was here before, and it needed a bigger effort now, but he looked. What light there was came from the fire, and whether she had gathered the logs or found them in the room no one ever knew. A vagrant stated afterwards that he had been in the house some days before and left his matchbox in it. By this fire Grizel was crouching. She was comparatively tidy and neat again. The dust was gone from her boots even. How she had managed to do it no one knows, but you remember how she loved to be neat. Her hands were extended to the blaze, and she was busy talking to herself. His hand struck the window heavily, and she looked up and saw him. She nodded and put her finger to her lips as a sign that he must be cautious. She had often in the long ago seen her mother signing thus to an imaginary face at the window, the face of the man who never came. Tommy went into the house, and she was so pleased to see him that she quite simpered. He put his arms round her, and she lay there with a little giggle of contentment. She was in a plot of heat. "Grizel, oh, my God!" he said. "Why do you look at me in that way?" She passed her hand across her eyes like one trying to think. "I woke up," she said at last. Corp appeared at the window now, and she pointed to him in terror. Thus had she seen her mother point in the long ago at faces that came there to frighten her. "Grizel," Tommy entreated her, "you know who I am, don't you?" She said his name at once, but her eyes were on the window. "They want to take me away," she whispered. "But you must come away, Grizel. You must come home." "This is home," she said. "It is sweet." After much coaxing he prevailed upon her to leave. With his arm round her and a terrible woe on his face, he took her to the doctor's house. She had her hands over her ears all the way. She thought the white river and the mountains and the villages and the crack of whips were marching with her still. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 31. The Man with the Greetin' Eyes. For many days she lay in a fever at the doctor's house, seeming sometimes to know where she was, but more often not. And night after night a man with a drawn face sat watching her. They entreated, they forced him to let them take his place, but from his room he heard her moan or speak, or he thought he heard her, or he heard a terrible stillness, and he stole back to listen. They might send him away, but when they opened the door he was there, with his drawn face, and often they were glad to see him, for there were times when he alone could interpret her wild demands and soothe those staring eyes. Once a scream startled the house. Someone had struck a match in the darkened chamber, and she thought she was in an arbour in St. Gian. They had to hold her in her bed by force at times. She had such a long way to walk before night, she said. She would struggle into a sitting posture and put her hands over her ears. Her great desire was not to sleep. "I should wake up," she explained fearfully. She took a dislike to Elspeth and called her Alice. These ravings, they said to each other, must have reference to what happened to her when she was away, and as they thought he knew no more of her wanderings than they, everyone marvelled at the intuition with which he read her thoughts. It was he who guessed that the striking of matches somehow terrified her, he who discovered that it was a horrid roaring river she thought she heard, and he pretended he heard it too, and persuaded her that if she lay very still it would run past. Nothing she said or did puzzled him. He read the raving of her mind, they declared admiringly, as if he held the cipher to it. "And the cipher is his love," Mrs. McLean said, with wet eyes. In the excitement of those days Elspeth talked much to her of Tommy's love for Grizel, and how she had refused him, and it went round the town with embellishments. It was generally believed now that she really had gone to London to see her father, and that his heartless behaviour had unhinged her mind. By David's advice, Corp and Gavinia did not contradict this story. It was as good as another, he told them, and better than the truth. But what was the truth? They asked greedily. "Oh, that he is a noble fellow," David replied grimly. They knew that, but he would tell them no more, however, though he knew all. Tommy had made full confession to the doctor, even made himself out worse than he was, as had to be his way when he was not making himself out better. "And I am willing to proclaim it all from the market-place," he said hoarsely, "if that is your wish." "I dare say you would almost enjoy doing that," said David, rather cruelly. "I dare say I should," Tommy said, with a gulp, and went back to Grizel's side. It was not, you may be sure, to screen him that David kept the secret. It was because he knew what many would say of Grizel if the nature of her journey were revealed. He dared not tell Elspeth even, for think of the woe to her if she learned that it was her wonderful brother who had brought Grizel to this pass. The Elspeths of this world always have some man to devote himself to them. If the Tommies pass away, the Davids spring up. For my own part, I think Elspeth would have found some excuse for Tommy. He said so himself to the doctor, for he wanted her to be told. "Or you would find the excuse for her in time," David responded. "Very likely," Tommy said. He was humble enough now, you see. David could say one thing only which would rouse him, namely, that Grizel was not to die in this fever, and for long it seemed impossible to say that. "Would you have her live if her mind remains affected?" he asked, and Tommy said firmly, "Yes." "You think, I suppose, that then you would have less for which to blame yourself?" "I suppose that is it, but don't waste time on me, Gemmell, when you have her life to save, if you can." Well, her life was saved, and Tommy's nursing had more to do with it than David's skill. David admitted it. The town talked of it. "Ay, Kent, he would find a wy," Corp said, though he had been among the most anxious. He and Aaron Latta were the first admitted to see her, when she was able once more to sit in a chair. They had been told to ask her no questions. She chatted pleasantly to them, and they thought she was quite her old self. They wondered to see Tommy still so sad-eyed. To Ailie she spoke freely of her illness, though not of what had occasioned it, and told her almost gleefully that David had promised to let her sew a little next week. There was one thing only that surprised Ailie. Grizel had said that as soon as she was a little stronger she was going home. "Does she mean to her father's house?" Ailie asked. This was what started the report that, touched no doubt by her illness, Grizel's unknown father had, after all, offered her a home. They discovered, however, what Grizel meant by home when one afternoon she escaped unseen from the doctor's house and was found again at Double Dykes, very indignant because someone had stolen the furniture. She seemed to know all her old friends except Elspeth, who was still Alice to her. Seldom now did she put her hands over her ears or see horrible mountains marching with her. She no longer remembered, save once or twice when she woke up, that she had ever been out of Thrums. To those who saw her casually, she was Grizel, gaunt, thin and pale and weak intellectually, but still the Grizel of old, except for the fixed idea that Double Dykes was her home. "You must not humour her in that delusion," David said sternly to Tommy. "When we cease to fight it, we have abandoned hope." So the weapon he always had his hand on was taken from Tommy, for he would not abandon hope. He fought gallantly. It was always he who brought her back from Double Dykes. She would not leave it with any other person, but she came away with him. "It's because she's so fond o' him," Corp said. But it was not. It was because she feared him, as all knew who saw them together. They were seen together a great deal when she was able to go out. Driving seemed to bring back the mountains to her eyes, so she walked, and it was always with the help of Tommy's arm. "It's a most pitiful sight," the people said. They pitied him even more than her, for though she might be talking gaily to him and leaning heavily on him, they could see that she mistrusted him. At the end of a sweet smile she would give him an ugly, furtive look. "She's like a cat you forced into your lap," they said, "and it lies quiet there, ready to jump the moment you let go your grip." They wondered would he never weary. He never wearied. Day after day he was saying the same things to her, and the end was always as the beginning. They came back to her entreaty that she should be allowed to go home as certainly as they came back to the doctor's house. "It is a long time, you know, Grizel, since you lived at Double Dykes, not since you were a child." "Not since I was a child," she said, as if she quite understood. "Then you went to live with your dear kind doctor, you remember. What was his name?" "Dr. McQueen. I love him." "But he died, and he left you his house to live in. It is your home, Grizel. He would be so grieved if he thought you did not make it your home." "It is my home," she said proudly, but when they returned to it she was loath to go in. "I want to go home," she begged. One day he took her to her rooms in Corp's house, thinking her old furniture would please her, and that was the day when she rocked her arms joyously again. But it was not the furniture that made her so happy. It was Corp's baby. "Oh, oh!" she cried in rapture, and held out her arms, and he ran into them, for there was still one person in Thrums who had no fear of Grizel. "It will be a damned shame," Corp said huskily, "if that woman never has no bairns o' her ain." They watched her crooning over the child, playing with him for a long time. You could not have believed that she required to be watched. She told him with hugs that she had come back to him at last. It was her first admission that she knew she had been away, and a wild hope came to Tommy that along the road he could not take her. She might be drawn by this little child. She discovered a rent in the child's pinafore and must mend it at once. She ran upstairs, as a matter of course, to her work-box and brought down a needle and thread. It was quite as if she was at home at last. "But you don't live here now, Grizel," Tommy said when she drew back at his proposal that they should go away. "You live at the doctor's house." "Do I, Gavinia?" she said beseechingly. "Is it here you want to bide?" Corp asked, and she nodded her head several times. "It would be so much more convenient," she said, looking at the child. "Would you take her back, Gavinia?" Tommy asked humbly, "if she continues to want it?" Gavinia did not answer. "Woman!" cried Corp. "I'm mortal wae for her," Gavinia said slowly, "but she needs to be waited on hand and foot." "I would come and do the waiting on her, hand and foot, Gavinia," Tommy said. And so it came about that a week afterwards Grizel was reinstalled in her old rooms. Every morning when Tommy came to see her, she asked him icily how Alice was. She seemed to think that Alice, as she called her, was his wife. He always replied, "You mean Elspeth," and she assented, but only, it was obvious, because she feared to contradict him. To Corp and Gavinia she would still say passionately, "I want to go home," and probably add fearfully, "Don't tell him." Yet, though this was not home to her, she seemed to be less unhappy here than in the doctor's house, and she found a great deal to do. All her old skill in needlework came back to her, and she sewed for the child such exquisite garments that she clapped her hands over them. One day Tommy came with a white face and asked Gavinia if she knew whether a small brown parcel had been among the things brought by Grizel from the doctor's house. "It was in the box sent after me from Switzerland," he told her, "and contained papers." Gavinia had seen no such package. "She may have hidden it," he said, and they searched, but fruitlessly. He questioned Grizel gently, but questions alarmed her, and he desisted. "It does not matter, Gavinia," he said, with a ghastly smile, but on the following Sunday, when Corp called at the doctor's house, the thought, "Have they found it?" leaped in front of all thought of Grizel. This was only for the time it takes to ask a question with the eyes, however, for Corp was looking very miserable. "I'm sweer to say it," he announced to Tommy and David, "but it has to be said. We canna keep her." Evidently something had happened, and Tommy rose to go to Grizel without even asking what it was. "Wait," David said, wrinkling his eyebrows, "till Corp tells us what he means by that. I knew it might come, Corp. Go on." "If it hadna been for the bairns," said Corp, "we would hae thole wi' her, however queer she was. But wi' the bairn, I tell you, it's no mouse. You'll have to take her away." "Whatever she has been to others," Tommy said, "she is always an angel with the child. His own mother could not be fonder of him." "That's it," Corp replied emphatically. "She's no the mother of him, but there's whiles when she thinks she is. We kept it frae you as long as we could." "As long as she is so good to him," David began. "But at thae times she's not," said Corp. "She begins to shiver most terrible, as if she saw fearsome things in her mind, and syne we see her looking at him like as if she wanted to do him a mischief. She says he's her brat, she thinks he's hers, and that he hasna been well come by." Tommy's hands rose in agony, and then he covered his face with them. "Go on, Corp," David said hoarsely. "We must have it all." "Sometimes," Corp went on painfully, "she canna help being fond o' him, though she thinks she shouldna hae had him. I've heard her saying 'my brat,' and syne bursing him closer to her, as though her shame just made him mair to her. Women are so queer about thae things. I've seen her sitting by his cradle, moaning to hersel', 'I did so want to be good. It would be sweet to be good,' and never stopping rocking the cradle, and a' the time the tears were rolling down." Tommy cried, "If there is any more to tell, Corp, be quick." "There's what I come here to tell you. It was no langer syne than jimply an hour. We thocht the bairn was playing at the Gavlend, and that Grizel was up the stair, but they werena, and I gaed straight to Double Dykes. She wasna there, but the bairn was, lying greeting on the floor. We found her in the den, sitting by the burn side, and she said we should never see him again, for she had drowned him. We're sweer, but you'll need to tak her away." "We shall take her away," David said, and when he and Tommy were left together, he asked, "Do you see what it means?" "It means that the horrors of her early days have come back to her, and that she is confusing her mother with herself." David's hands were clenched. "That is not what I am thinking of. We have to take her away. They have done far more than we had any right to ask of them. Sandys, where are we to take her to?" "Do even you grow tired of her?" Tommy cried. David said between his teeth, "We hope there will soon be a child in this house also. God forgive me, but I cannot bring her back here." "She cannot be in a house where there is a child," said Tommy, with a bitter laugh. "Gemmell, it is Grizel we are speaking of. Do you remember what she was?" "I remember." "Well, where are we to send her?" David turned his pained eyes full on Tommy. "No!" Tommy cried vehemently. "Sandys," said David firmly, "that is what it has come to. They will take good care of her." He sat down with a groan. "Have done with heroics," he said savagely, when Tommy would have spoken. "I have been prepared for this. There is no other way." "I have been prepared for it too," Tommy said, controlling himself, "but there is another way. I can marry her, and I am going to do it." "I don't know that I can countenance that," David said, after a pause. "It seems an infernal shame." "Don't trouble about me," replied Tommy hoarsely. "I shall do it willingly." And then it was the doctor's turn to laugh. "You?" he said, with a terrible scorn, as he looked Tommy up and down. "I was not thinking of you. All my thoughts were of her. I was thinking of how cruel to her if some day she came to her right mind and found herself tied for life to the man who had brought her to this pass." Tommy winced and walked up and down. "Desire to marry her gone?" asked David savagely. "No," Tommy said. He sat down. "You have the key to me, Gemmell," he went on quietly. "I gave it to you. You know I am a man of sentiment only, but you are without a scrap of it yourself, and so you will never quite know what it is. It has its good points. We are a kindly people. I was perhaps pluming myself on having made an heroic proposal. and though you have made me see it just now as you see it, I shall probably soon be putting on the same grand airs again. Lately I discovered that the children who see me with Grizel call me the man with the greetin' eyes. If I have greetin' eyes, it was real grief that gave them to me. But when I heard what I was called, it made me self-conscious, and I have tried to look still more lugubrious ever since. It seems monstrous to you, but that, I believe, is the kind of thing I shall always be doing. But it does not mean that I feel no real remorse. They were greetin' eyes before I knew it, and though I may pose grotesquely as a fine fellow for finding Grizel a home where there is no child, and can never be a child, I shall not cease, night or day, from tending her. It will be a grim business, Gemmell, as you know, and if I am sentimental, Tommy, through it all, why grudge me my comic little strut?" David said, "You can't take her to London." "I shall take her to wherever she wants to go." "There is one place only she wants to go to, and that is Double Dykes." "I am prepared to take her there." "And your work?" "It must take second place now." "I must write. It is the only thing I can do. If I could make a living at anything else, I would give up writing altogether." "Why?" "She would be pleased if she could understand, and writing is the joy of my life." "Two reasons." But the doctor smiled. "You are right," said Tommy. "I see. I was really thinking what a fine picture of self-sacrifice I should make, sitting in Double Dykes at a loom." They talked of ways and means, and he had to admit that he had little money, but the new book would bring in a good deal, David supposed. "The manuscript is lost," Tommy replied, crushing down his agitation. "Lost? When? Where?" "I don't know. It was in the bag I left behind at St. Gian, and I supposed it was still in it when the bag was forwarded to me here. I did not look for more than a month. I took credit to myself for neglecting my manuscript, and when at last I looked, it was not there. I telegraphed and wrote to the innkeeper at St. Gian, and he replied that my things had been packed at his request, in presence of my friends there, the two ladies you know of. I wrote to them, and they replied that this was so, and said they thought they remembered seeing in the bottom of the bag some such parcel in brown paper as I described. But it is not there now, and I have given up all hope of ever seeing it again. No, I have no other copy. Every page was written half a dozen times, but I kept the final copy only." "It is scarcely a thing anyone would steal." "No, I suppose they took it out of the bag at St. Gian and forgot to pack it again. It was probably flung away as of no account. Could it have been taken out on the way here?" "The key was tied to the handle so that the custom officials might be able to open the bag. Perhaps they are fonder of English manuscripts than one would expect, or more careless of them." "You can think of no other way in which it might have disappeared?" "None," Tommy said, and then the doctor faced him squarely. "Are you trying to screen Grizel?" he asked. "Is it true what people are saying?" "What are they saying?" "That she destroyed it. I heard that yesterday, and told them your manuscript was in my house, as I thought it was." "Was it she?" "No, no. Gavinia must have started that story. I did look for the package among Grizel's things." "What made you think of that?" "I had seen her looking into my bag one day, and she used to say I loved my manuscripts too much ever to love her, but I am sure she did not do it." "Be truthful, Sandys. You know how she always loved the truth." "Well, then, I suppose it was she." After a pause, the doctor said, "It must be about as bad as having a limb lopped off." "If only I had been offered that alternative," Tommy replied. "And yet," David mused, better pleased with him, "you have not cried out." "Have I not? I have rolled about in agony and invoked the gods, and cursed and whimpered, only I take care that no one shall see me." "And that no one should know poor Grizel had done this thing. I admire you for that, Sandys." "But it has leaked out, you see," Tommy said, "and they will all be admiring me for it at the wedding, and no doubt I shall be cocking my greetin' eyes at them to know how much they are admiring." But when the wedding day came he was not doing that. While he and Grizel stood up before Mr. Dishart in the doctor's parlour, he was thinking of her only. His eyes never left her, not even when he had to reply, "I do." His hand pressed hers all the time. He kept giving her reassuring little nods and smiles, and it was thus that he helped Grizel through. Had Mr. Dishart understood what was in her mind, he would not have married them. To her it was no real marriage. She thought they were tricking the minister so that she should be able to go home. They had rehearsed the ceremony together many times, and oh, she was eager to make no mistake. If they were to find out, she would say apprehensively, and then perhaps giggle at the slyness of it all. Tommy had to make merry with her, as if it was one of his boyish plays. If he was overcome with the pain of it, she sobbed at once and wrung her hands. She was married in grey silk. She had made the dress herself, as beautifully as all her things were made. Tommy remembered how once long ago she had told him as a most exquisite secret that she had decided on grey silk. Corp and Gavinia and Ailie and Aaron Latta were the only persons asked to the wedding, and when it was over they said they never saw anyone stand up by a woman's side looking so anxious to be her man, and I am sure that in this they did Tommy no more than justice. It was a sad day to Elspeth. Could she be expected to smile while her noble brother did this great deed of sacrifice? But she bore up bravely, partly for his sake, partly for the sake of one unborn. The ring was no plain hoop of gold, it was garnets all the way round. She had seen it on Elspeth's finger and craved it so greedily that it became her wedding ring, and from the moment she had it she ceased to dislike Elspeth, and pitied her very much, as if she thought happiness went with the ring. "Poor Alice," she said when she saw Elspeth crying at the wedding, and having started to go away with Tommy, she came back to say again, "Poor, poor Alice." Corp flung an old shoe after them. End of chapter 31.
Chapter 32 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Franziska Powell. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Tommy's best work. And thus was begun a year and a half of as great devotion as remorseful man ever gave to woman. When she was asleep and he could not write, his mind would sometimes roam after abandoned things. It sought them in the night as a savage beast steals forth for water to slake the thirst of many days. But if she stirred in her sleep, they were all dispelled. There was not a moment in that 18 months when he was 20 yards from Grizel's side. He would not let himself lose hope. All the others lost it. The only thing you can do is to humour her. Even David was reduced in time to saying. But Tommy replied cheerily, "Not a bit of it." Every morning he had to begin at the same place as on the previous morning, and he was always as ready to do it, and as patient as if this were the first time. "I think she is a little more herself today," he would say determinedly, till David wondered to hear him. "She makes no progress, Sandys. I can at least keep her from slipping back." And he did, and there's no doubt that this was what saved Grizel in the end. How he strove to prevent her slipping back. The morning was the time when she was least troubled, and had he humoured her then, they would often have been easy hours for him. But it was the time when he tried most doggedly, with a gentleness she could not ruffle, to teach her the alphabet of who she was. She coaxed him to let her off those mental struggles. She turned petulant and sulky. She was willing to be good and sweet if he would permit her to sew or to sing to herself instead, or to sit staring at the fire. But he would not yield. He promised those things as the reward, and in the end she stood before him like a child as lessons. "What's your name?" The catechism always began thus. "Grizel," she said obediently, as if it was a day when she wanted to please him. "And my name?" "Tommy." Once, to his great delight, she said, "Sentimental Tommy." He quite bragged about this to David. "Where's your home?" "Here." She was never in doubt about this, and it was always a pleasure to hear her to say it. "Did you live here long ago?" She nodded. "And then did you live for a long time somewhere else?" "Yes." "Where was it?" "Here." "No, it was with the old doctor. You were his little housekeeper. Don't you remember? Try to remember, Grizel. He loved you so much." She tried to think. Her face was very painful when she tried to think. "It hurts," she said. "Do you remember him, Grizel?" "Please let me sing," she begged. "Such a sweet song." "Do you remember the old doctor who called you his little housekeeper? He used to sit in that chair." The old chair was among Grizel's many possessions that had been brought to Double Dykes, and her face lit up with recollection. She ran to the chair and kissed it. "What was his name, Grizel?" "I should love to know his name," she said wistfully. He told her the name many times, and she repeated it docilely. Or perhaps she remembered her dear doctor quite well to-day, and thought Tommy was someone in need of his services. "He has gone into the country," she said, as she had so often said to anxious people at the door. "But he won't be long, and I shall give him your message the moment he comes in." But Tommy would not pass that. He explained to her again and again that the doctor was dead, and perhaps she would remember, or perhaps, without remembering, she said she was glad he was dead. "Why are you glad, Grizel?" She whispered, as if frightened she might be overheard. "I don't want him to see me like this." It was one of the pathetic things about her that she seemed at times to have some vague understanding of her condition, and then she would sob. Her tears were anguish to him, but it was at those times that she clung to him as if she knew he was trying to do something for her, and that encouraged him to go on. He went over, step by step, the time when she lived alone in the doctor's house, the time of his own coming back, her love for him, and his treatment of her, the story of the garnet ring, her coming to Switzerland, her terrible walk, her return. He would miss out nothing, for he was fighting for her. Day after day, month by month, it went on, and tomorrow, perhaps, she would insist that the old doctor and this man who asked her so many questions were one. And Tommy argued with her until he had driven that notion out, to make way for another, and then he fought it, and so on and on, all round the circle of her delusions, day by day and month by month. She knew that he sometimes wrote while she was asleep, for she might start up from her bed or from the sofa, and there he was, laying down his pen to come to her. Her eyes were never open for any large fraction of a minute without his knowing, and immediately he went to her, nodding and smiling, lest she had wakened with some fear upon her. Perhaps she refused to sleep again unless he promised to put away those horrid papers for the night, and however intoxicating a point he had reached in his labours, he always promised and kept his word. He was most scrupulous in keeping any promise he made her, and one great result was that she trusted him implicitly. Whatever others promised, she doubted them. There were times when she seemed to be casting about in her mind for something to do that would please him, and then she would bring pieces of paper to him, and pen and ink, and tell him to write. She thought this very clever of her, and expected to be praised for it. But she might also bring him writing materials at times when she hated him very much, but there would be sly smiles, even pretended affection, on her face, unless she thought he was not looking, when she cast him ugly glances. Her intention was to trick him into forgetting her so that she might talk to herself or slip out of the room to the den, just as her mother had done in the days when it was Grizel who had to be tricked. He would not let her talk to herself until he had tried endless ways of exorcising that demon by interesting her in some sort of work, by going out with her, by talking of one thing and another, till at last a subject was lit upon that made her forget to brood. But sometimes it seemed best to let her go to the den. She was in such a quiver of desire to go. She hurried to it, so that he had to stride to keep up with her. And he said little until they got there, for she was too excited to listen. She was very like her mother again, but it was not the man who never came that she went in search of. It was a lost child. I have not the heart to tell of the pitiful scenes in the den while Grizel searched for her child. They always ended in those two walking silently home, and for a day or two Grizel would be ill, and Tommy tended her, so that she was soon able to hasten to the den again, holding out her arms as she ran. "She makes no progress," David said. "I can keep her from slipping back," Tommy still replied. The doctor marvelled, but even he did not know half of all her husband did for Grizel. None could know half of who was not there by night. Here, at least, was one day ending placidly, they might say, when she was in a tractable mood, so tractable that she seemed to be one of themselves, and Tommy assented brightly, though he knew, and he alone, that you could never be sure the long day had ended till the next began. Often the happiest beginning had the most painful ending. The greatest pleasure he could give her was to take her to see Elspeth's baby girl, or that sturdy rogue, young Siach, who could now count with ease up to 7, but swayed at 8, and toppled over on his way to 10. Or their mothers brought them to her, and Grizel understood quite well who her visitors were, sometimes even called Elspeth by her right name, and did the honours of her house irreproachably, and presided at the tea-table, and was rapture personified when she held the baby Jean, called after Tommy's mother, and sat gaily on the floor, ready to catch little Corp when he would not stop at 7. But Tommy, whom nothing escaped, knew with what depression she might pay for her joy when they had gone. Despite all his efforts, she might sit talking to herself, at first of pleasant things, and then of things less pleasant. Or she stared at her reflection in the long mirror and said, "Isn't she sweet?" Or, "She is not really sweet, and she did so want to be good." Or, instead of that, she would suddenly go upon her knees and say, with clasped hand, the childish prayer, "Save me from masterful man," which Jean Miles had told Tommy to teach Elspeth. No one could have looked less masterful at those times than Tommy, but Grizel did not seem to think so, and probably they had that night once more to search the den. The children do her harm. She must not see them again, he decided. They give her pleasure at the time, David said. It lightens your task now and then. It is the future I'm thinking of, Gemel. If she cannot progress, she shall not fall back. As for me, never mind me. Elspeth is in a sad state about you, though, and you can get through so little work. Enough for all our wants. He was writing magazine papers only. The public will forget you. They have forgotten me. David was openly sorry for him now. If only your manuscript had been saved. Yes, I never thought the little gods would treat me so scurvily as that. Who? Did I never tell you of my little gods? I so often emerged triumphant from my troubles, and so undeservedly, that I thought I was especially looked after by certain tricky spirits in return for the entertainment I gave them. My little gods, I called them, and we had quite a bowing acquaintance. But you see, at the critical moment they flew away laughing. He always knew that the lost manuscript was his great work. My seventh wave, he called it, and though all the conditions were favourable, he said, I know that I could run to nothing more than little waves at present. As for rewriting that book, I can't. I have tried. Yet he was not asking for commiseration. Tell Elspeth not to worry about me. If I have no big ideas just now, I have some very passable little ones, and one in particular that, he drew a great breath. If only Grizel were better. That breath again. I think Tommy Sandys could find a way of making the public remember him again. So David interpreted it, and though he had been about to say, How changed you are, he did not say it. And Tommy, who had been keeping an eye on her all this time, returned to Grizel. As she had been through that long year, so she was during the first half of the next, and day by day and night by night he tended her. And still the same scenes were enacted in infinite variety, and still he would not give in. Everything seemed to change with the seasons, except Grizel, and Tommy's devotion to her. Yet you know that she recovered, ever afterwards to be herself again. And though it seemed to come in the end as suddenly as the sight may be restored by the removal of a bandage, I suppose it had been going on all the time, and that her reason was given back to her on the day she had strength to make use of it. Tommy was the instrument of her recovery. He had fought against her slipping backwards, so that she could not do it. It was as if he had built a wall behind her, and in time her mind accepted that wall as impregnable, and took a forward movement. And with every step she took, he pushed the wall after her, so that still if she moved, it must be forward. Thus Grizel progressed imperceptibly, as along a dark corridor towards the door that shut out the light, and on a day in early spring the door fell. Many of them had cried for a shock as her only chance, but it came most quietly. She had lain down on the sofa that afternoon to rest, and when she woke she was Grizel again. At first she was not surprised to find herself in that room, nor to see that man nodding and smiling reassuringly. They had come out of the long dream with her, to make the awakening less abrupt. He did not know what had happened. When he knew, a terror that this could not last seized him. He was concealing it while he answered her puzzled questions. All the time he was telling her how they came to be there, he was watching in agony for the change. She remembered everything up to her return to Thrums. Then she walked into a mist. The truth, she begged of him, when he would have let her off by pretending that she had been ill only. Surely it was the real Grizel who begged for the truth. She took his hand and held it when he told her of their marriage. She cried softly, because she feared that she might again become as she had been, but he said that was impossible, and smiled confidently, and all the time he was watching in agony for the change. "Do you forgive me, Grizel? I have always had a dread that when you recovered you would cease to care for me." He knew that this would please her if she was the real Grizel, and he was so anxious to make her happy for evermore. She put his hand to her lips and smiled at him through her tears. Hers was the love that could never change. Suddenly she sat up. "Whose baby was it?" she asked. "I don't know what you mean, Grizel," he said uneasily. "I remember vaguely," she told him, "a baby in white, whom I seemed to chase, but I could never catch her. Was it a dream only?" "You're thinking of Elspeth's little girl, perhaps. She was often brought to see you." "Has Elspeth a baby?" She rose to go exultantly to Elspeth. "But too small a baby, Grizel, to run from you, even if she wanted to." "What is she like?" "She is always laughing." This sweet. Grizel rocked her arms in rapture, and smiled her crooked smile at the thought of a child who was always laughing. "But I don't remember her," she said. It was a sad little baby I seemed to see. End of Tommy's Best Work. Recording by Franziska Paul.
Chapter 33 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 33 The Little Gods Return with a Lady. Grizel's clear, searching eyes that were always asking for the truth came back to her, and I seemed to see them on me now, watching lest I shirk the end. Thus I can make no pretence to please you that it was a new Tommy at last. We have seen how he gave his life to her during those 18 months, but he could not make himself anew. They say we can do it, so I suppose he did not try hard enough, but God knows how hard he tried. He went on trying. In those first days she sometimes asked him, "Did you do it out of love, or was it pity only?" And he always said it was love. He said it adoringly. He told her all that love meant to him, and it meant everything that he thought Grizel would like it to mean. When she ceased to ask this question, he thought it was because he had convinced her. They had a honeymoon by the sea. He insisted upon it with boyish eagerness, and as they walked on the links or sat in their room, he would exclaim ecstatically, "How happy I am! I wonder if there were ever two people quite so happy as you and I." And if he waited for an answer, as he usually did, she might smile lightly and say, "Few people have gone through so much." "Is there any woman in this world, Grizel, with whom you would change places?" "No, none," she said at once, and when he was sure of it, but never until he was sure, he would give his mind a little holiday. And then perhaps those candid eyes would rest searchingly upon him, but always with a brave smile ready should he chance to look up. And it was just the same when they returned to Double Dykes, which they added to and turned into a comfortable home, Tommy trying to become a lover by taking thought, and Grizel not letting on that it could not be done in that way. She thought it was very sweet of him to try so hard, sweeter of him than if he really had loved her, though not, of course, quite so sweet to her. He was a boy only. She knew that, despite all he had gone through, he was still a boy, and boys cannot love. Oh, who would be so cruel as to ask a boy to love? That Grizel's honeymoon should never end was his grand ambition, and he took elaborate precautions against becoming a matter-of-fact husband. Every morning he ordered himself to gaze at her with rapture, as if he had wakened to the glorious thought that she was his wife. "I can't help it, Grizel. It comes to me every morning with the same shock of delight, and I begin the day with a song of joy. You make the world as fresh and interesting to me as if I had just broken like a chicken through the egg-shell." He rose at the earliest hours, "so that I can have the longer day with you," he said gaily. If, when sitting at his work, he forgot her for an hour or two, he reproached himself for it afterwards, and next day he was more careful. "Grizel," he would cry suddenly, flinging down his pen, "you are my wife. Do you hear me, madam? You hear, and yet you can sit there calmly darning socks. Excuse me," he would say to his work, "while I do a dance." He rose impulsively and brought his papers nearer her. With a table between them, she was several feet away from him, which was more, he said, than he could endure. "Sit down for a moment, Grizel, and let me look at you. I want to write something most splendiferous to-day, and I am sure to find it in your face. I have ceased to be an original writer. All the purple patches are cribbed from you." He made a point of taking her head in his hands and looking long at her with thoughts too deep for utterance. Then he would fall on his knees and kiss the hem of her dress, and so back to his book again. And in time it was all sweet to Grizel. She could not be deceived, but she loved to see him playing so kind a part. And after some sadness to which she could not help giving way, she put all vain longings aside. She folded them up and put them away like the beautiful linen, so that she might see more clearly what was left to her and how best to turn it to account. "He did not love her, not as I love him," she said to herself, "not as married people ought to love, but in the other way he loves me dearly." By the other way she meant that he loved her as he loved Elspeth, and loved them both just as he had loved them when all three played in the Den. He would love me if he could. She was certain of that. She decided that love does not come to all people, as is the common notion, that there are some who cannot fall in love, and that he was one of them. He was complete in himself, she decided. Is it a pity for him that he married me? It would be a pity if he could love some other woman, but I am sure he could never do that. If he could love anyone, it would be me. We both want it so much. He does not need a wife, but he needs some one to take care of him. All men need that, and I can do it much better than any other person. Had he not married me, he never would have married, but he may fall ill, and then how useful I shall be to him. He will grow old, and perhaps it won't be quite so lonely to him when I am there. It would have been a pity for him to marry me if I had been a foolish woman who asked for more love than he can give, but I shall never do that, so I think it is not a pity. Is it a pity for me? Oh, no, no, no. Is he sorry he did it? At times, is he just a weeny bit sorry? She watched him and decided rightly that he was not sorry the weeniest bit. It was a sweet consolation to her. Is he really happy? Yes, of course he is happy when he is writing, but is he quite contented at other times? I do honestly think he is. And if he is happy now, how much happier I shall be able to make him when I have put away all my selfish thoughts and think only of him. The most exquisite thing in human life is to be married to one who loves you as you love him. There could be no doubt of that. But she saw also that the next best thing was the kind of love this boy gave to her, and she would always be grateful for the second best. In her prayers she thanked God for giving it to her and promised him to try to merit it. And all day and every day she kept her promise. There could not have been a brighter or more energetic wife than Grizel. The amount of work she found to do in that small house, which his devotion had made so dear to her that she could not leave it, her gaiety, her masterful airs when he wanted something that was not good for him, the artfulness with which she sought to help him in various matters without his knowing, her satisfaction when he caught her at it, as clever Tommy was constantly doing. What a success it has turned out, David would say delightedly to himself, and Grizel was almost as jubilant because it was so far from being a failure. It was only sometimes in the night that she lay very still, with little wells of water on her eyes, and through them saw one, the dream of woman, whom she feared could never be hers. That boy, Tommy, never knew why she did not want to have a child. He thought that for the present she was afraid, but the reason was that she believed it would be wicked when he did not love her as she loved him. She could not be sure. She had to think it all out for herself. With little wells of sadness on her eyes, she prayed in the still night to God to tell her, but she could never hear his answer. She no longer sought to teach Tommy how he should write. That quaint desire was abandoned from the day when she learned that she had destroyed his greatest work. She had not destroyed it, as we shall see, but she presumed she had, as Tommy thought so. He had tried to conceal this from her to save her pain, but she had found it out, and it seemed to Grizel, grown distrustful of herself, that the man who could bear such a loss as he had borne it was best left to write as he chose. "It was not that I did not love your books," she said, "but that I loved you more, and I thought they did you harm." "In the days when I had wings," he answered, and she smiled. "Any feathers left, you think, Grizel?" he asked jocularly, and turned his shoulders to her for examination. "A great many, sir," she said, "and I am glad. I used to want to pull them all out, but now I like to know that they are still there, for it means that you remain among the facts, not because you can't fly, but because you won't." "I still have my little fights with myself," he blurted out boyishly, though it was a thing he had never meant to tell her, and Grizel pressed his hand for telling her what she already knew so well. The new book, of course, was The Wandering Child. "I wonder whether any of you read it now. Your fathers and mothers thought a great deal of that slim volume, but it would make little stir in an age in which all the authors are trying who can say 'damn' loudest. It is but a reverie about a child who is lost, and his parents search for him in terror of what may have befallen. But they find him in a wood, singing joyfully to himself because he is free, and he fears to be caged again, so runs farther from them into the wood, and is running still, singing to himself because he is free, free, free." That is really all, but T. Sandys knew how to tell it. The moment he conceived the idea, we have seen him speaking of it to the doctor, he knew that it was the idea for him. He forgot at once that he did not really care for children. He said reverently to himself, "I can pull it off," and, as was always the way with him, the better he pulled it off, the more he seemed to love them. "It is myself who is writing at last, Grizel," he said, as he read it to her. She thought, and you can guess whether she was right, that it was the book he loved rather than the children. She thought, and you can guess again, that it was not his ideas about children that he had got into the book, but hers. But she did not say so. She said it was the sweetest of his books to her. I have heard of another reading he gave. This was after the publication of the book. He had gone into Corp's house one Sunday, and Gavinia was there reading the work to her lord and master, while little Corp disported on the floor. She read as if all the words meant the same thing, and it was more than Tommy could endure. He read for her, and his eyes grew moist as he read, for it was the most exquisite of his chapters about the lost child. You would have said that no one loved children quite so much as T. Sandys, but little Corp would not keep quiet, and suddenly Tommy jumped up and boxed his ears. He then proceeded with the reading, while Gavinia glowered at, and Corp senior scratched his head. On the way home he saw what had happened, and laughed at the humour of it, then grew depressed, then laughed recklessly. "Is it Sentimental Tommy still?" he said to himself with a groan. Seldom a week passed without his being reminded in some such sudden way that it was Sentimental Tommy still. But she shall never know, he vowed, and he continued to be half a hero. His name was once more in many mouths. "Come back and be made of more than ever," cried that society which he had once enlivened. "Come and hear the pretty things we are saying about you. Come and make the prettier replies that are already on the tip of your tongue, for, oh, Tommy, you know they are. Bring her with you if you must, but don't you think that the nice quiet country with the thingumbobs all in bloom would suit her best? It is essential that you should run up to see your publisher, is it not? The men have dinners for you if you want them, but we know you don't. Your yearning eyes are on the ladies, Tommy. We are making up theatre parties of the old entrancing kind. You should see our new gowns. Please come back and help us to put on our cloaks, Tommy. There is a dance on Monday. Come and sit it out with us. Do you remember the garden party where you said, well, the laurel walk is still there. The beauties of 2 years ago are still here, and there are new beauties, and their noses are slightly tilted, but no man can move them. Ha! Do you pull yourself together at that? We were always the reward for your labours, Tommy. Your books are move one in the game of making love to us. Don't be afraid that we shall forget it is a game. We know it is, and that is why we suit you. Come and play in London as you used to play in the Den. It is all you need of women. Come and have your fill, and we shall send you back refreshed. We are not asking you to be disloyal to her, only to leave her happy and contented, and take a holiday. He heard their seductive voices. They danced around him in numbers, for they knew that the more there were of them, the better he would be pleased. They whispered in his ear, and then ran away looking over their shoulders. But he would not budge. There was one more dangerous than the rest. Her he saw before the others came, and after they had gone. She was a tall, incredibly slight woman, with eyelashes that needed help, and a most disdainful mouth and nose, and she seemed to look scornfully at Tommy, and then stand waiting. He was in two minds about what she was waiting for, and often he had a fierce desire to go to London to find out, but he never went. He played the lover to Grizel as before, not to intoxicate himself, but always to make life sunnier to her. If she stayed longer with Elspeth than the promised time, he became anxious and went in search of her. "I have not been away an hour," she said, laughing at him, holding little Jean up to laugh at him. "But I cannot do without you for an hour," he answered ardently. He still laid down his pen to gaze with rapture at her and cry, "My wife!" She wanted him to go to London for a change, and without her, and his heart leaped into his mouth to prevent his saying no. Yet he said it, though in the Tommy way. "Without you!" he exclaimed. "Oh, Grizel, do you think I could find happiness apart from you for a day? And could you let me go?" And he looked with agonized reproach at her, and sat down, clutching his head. "It would be very hard to me," she said softly, "but if the change did you good——" "A change from you! Oh, Grizel, Grizel! Or I could go with you." "When you don't want to go?" he cried huskily. "You think I could ask it of you?" He quite broke down, and she had to comfort him. She was smiling divinely at him all the time, as if sympathy had brought her to love even the Tommy way of saying things. "I thought it would be sweet to you to see how great my faith in you is now," she said. This was the true reason why generous Grizel had proposed to him to go. She knew he was more afraid than she of sentimental Tommy, and she thought her faith would be a helping hand to him as it was. He had no regard for Lady Pippinworth. Of all the women he had dallied with, she was the one he liked the least, for he never liked where he could not esteem. Perhaps she had some good in her, but the good in her had never appealed to him, and he knew it, and refused to harbour her in his thoughts now. He cast her out determinedly when she seemed to enter them unbidden. But still he was vain. She came disdainfully and stood waiting. We have seen him wondering what she waited for, but though he could not be sure, and so was drawn to her, he took it as acknowledgment of his prowess, and so was helped to run away. To walk away would be the more exact term, for his favourite method of exorcising this lady was to rise from his chair and take a long walk with Grizel. Occasionally, if she was occupied, and a number of duties our busy Grizel found to hand, he walked alone, and he would not let himself brood. Someone had once walked from Thrums to the top of the Law and back in 3 hours, and Tommy made several gamesome attempts to beat the record, setting out to escape that willowy woman, soon walking her down and returning in a glow of animal spirits. It was on one of these occasions, when there was nothing in his head but ambition to do the 5th mile within the 11 minutes, that he suddenly met her ladyship face to face. We have now come to the last fortnight of Tommy's life. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 34. A way is found for Tommy. A moment for which he had tried to prepare himself was come, and Tommy gulped down his courage, which had risen suddenly to his mouth, leaving his chest in a panic. Outwardly he seemed unmoved, but within he was beating to arms. "This is the test of us," all that was good in him cried, as it answered his summons. They began by shaking hands, as is always the custom in the ring. Then, without any preliminary sparring, Lady Pippinworth immediately knocked him down. "That is to say," she remarked, with a little laugh, "how very stout you are getting." I swear by all the gods that it was untrue. He had not got very stout, though undeniably he had got stouter. "How well you are looking" would have been a very ladylike way of saying it, but his girth was best not referred to at all. Those who liked him had learned this long ago, and Grizel always shifted the buttons without comment. Her malicious ladyship had found his one weak spot at once. He had a reply ready for every other opening in the English tongue, but now he could writhe only. "Who would have expected to meet her here?" he said at last feebly. She explained, and he had guessed it already, that she was again staying with the Rintouls. The castle, indeed, was not half a mile from where they stood. "But I think I really came to see you," she informed him with engaging frankness. It was very good of her, he intimated stiffly, but the stiffness was chiefly because she was still looking in an irritating way at his waist. Suddenly she looked up. To Tommy it was as if she had raised the siege. "Why aren't you nice to me?" she asked prettily. "I want to be," he replied. She showed him a way. "When I saw you steaming towards the castle so swiftly," she said, dropping badinage, "the hope entered my head that you had heard of my arrival." She had come a step nearer, and it was like an invitation to return to the arbour. "This is the test of us," all that was good in Tommy cried once more to him. "No, I had not heard," he replied, bravely if baldly. "I was taking a smart walk only." "Why so smart as that?" He hesitated, and her eyes left his face and travelled downward. "Were you trying to walk it off?" she asked sympathetically. He was stung, and replied in words that were regretted as soon as spoken. "I was trying to walk you off." A smile of satisfaction crossed her impudent face. "I succeeded," he added sharply. "How cruel of you to say so when you had made me so very happy. Do you often take smart walks, Mr. Sandys?" "Often." "And always with me?" "I leave you behind." "With Mrs. Sandys?" Had she seemed to be in the least affected by their meeting, it would have been easy to him to be a contrite man at once. Any sign of shame on her part would have filled him with desire to take all the blame upon himself. Had she cut him dead, he would have begun to respect her, but she smiled disdainfully only, and stood waking. She was still as ever a cold passion, inviting his warm ones to leap at it. He shuddered a little, but controlled himself and did not answer her. "I suppose she is the lady of the arbour?" Lady Pippinworth inquired, with mild interest. "She is the lady of my heart," Tommy replied valiantly. "Alas!" said Lady Pippinworth, putting her hand over her own. But he felt himself more secure now, and could even smile at the woman for thinking she was able to provoke him. "Look upon me," she requested, "as a deputation sent north to discover why you have gone into hiding." "I suppose a country life does seem exile to you," he replied calmly, and suddenly his bosom rose with pride in what was coming. Tommy always heard his finest things coming a moment before they came. "If I have retired," he went on windily, "from the insincerities and glitter of life in town," but it was not his face she was looking at, it was his waist. "The reason is obvious," he rapped out. She nodded assent without raising her eyes. Yet he still controlled himself. His waist, like some fair tortured lady of romance, was calling to his knighthood for defence, but with the truer courage he affected not to hear. "I am in hiding, as you call it," he said doggedly, "because my life here is such a round of happiness as I never hoped to find on earth, and I owe it all to my wife. If you don't believe me, ask Lord or Lady Rintoul, or any other person in this countryside who knows her." But her ladyship had already asked, and been annoyed by the answer. She assured Tommy that she believed he was happy. "I have often heard," she said musingly, "that the stout people are the happiest." "I am not so stout," he barked. "Now I call that brave of you," said she admiringly. "That is so much the wisest way to take it, and I am sure you are right not to return to town after what you were. It would be a pity. Somehow it," and again her eyes were on the wrong place, "it does not seem to go with the books. And yet," she said philosophically, "I dare say you feel just the same." "I feel very much the same," he replied warningly. "That is the tragedy of it," said she. She told him that the new book had brought the Tommy Society to life again, and it could not hold its meetings with the old enthusiasm, could it, she asked sweetly, "if you came back?" "Oh, I think you act most judiciously. Fancy how melancholy if they had to announce that the society had been wound up, owing to the stoutness of the master." Tommy's mouth opened twice before any words could come out. "Take care!" he cried. "Of what?" said she, curling her lip. He begged her pardon. "You don't like me, Lady Pippinworth," he said, watching himself, "and I don't wonder at it, and you have discovered a way of hurting me, of which you make rather unmerciful use. Well, I don't wonder at that either. If I am stoutish, I have at least the satisfaction of knowing that it gives you entertainment, and I owe you that amend and more." He was really in a fury and burning to go on. "For I did have the whip hand of you once, madam," etc., etc. But by a fine effort he held his rage a prisoner, and the admiration of himself that this engendered lifted him into the sublime. "For I so far forgot myself," said Tommy in a glow, "as to try to make you love me. You were beautiful and cold. No man had ever stirred you. My one excuse is that to be loved by such as you was no small ambition. My fitting punishment is that I failed." He knew he had not failed, and so could be magnanimous. "I failed utterly," he said, with grandeur. "You were laughing at me all the time. If proof of it were needed, you have given it now by coming here to mock me. I thought I was stronger than you, but I was ludicrously mistaken, and you taught me a lesson I richly deserved. You did me good, and I thank you for it. Believe me, Lady Pippinworth, when I say that I admit my discomfiture, and remain your very humble and humbled servant." Now, was not that good of Tommy? You would think it still better were I to tell you what part of his person she was looking at while he said it. He held out his hand generously. There was no noble act he could not have performed for her just now, but whatever her ladyship wanted, it was not to say good-bye. "Do you mean that you never cared for me?" she asked, with the tremor that always made Tommy kind. "Never cared for you!" he exclaimed fervently. "What were you not to me in those golden days?" It was really a magnanimous cry, meant to help her self-respect, nothing more, but it alarmed the good in him, and he said sternly, "But of course that is all over now. It is only a sweet memory," he added, to make these two remarks mix. The sentiment of this was so agreeable to him that he was half thinking of raising her hand chivalrously to his lips when Lady Pippinworth said, "But if it is all over now, why have you still to walk me off?" "Have you never had to walk me off?" said Tommy, forgetting himself, and to his surprise she answered, "Yes." "But this meeting has cured me," she said, with dangerous graciousness. "Dear Lady Pippinworth," replied Tommy ardently, thinking that his generosity had touched her, "if anything I have said—" "It is not so much what you have said," she answered, and again she looked at the wrong part of him. He gave way in the waist, and then drew himself up. "If so little a thing as that helps you—" he began haughtily. "Little!" she cried reproachfully. He tried to go away. He turned. "There was a time," he thundered. "It is over," said she. "When you were at my feet," said Tommy. "It is over," she said. "It could come again." She laughed a contemptuous "No." "Yes!" Tommy cried. "Too stout," said she, with a drawl. He went closer to her. She stood waiting disdainfully, and his arms fell. "Too stout," she repeated. "Let us put it in that way, since it pleases you," said Tommy, heavily. "I am too stout," he could not help adding. "And be thankful, Lady Pippinworth, let us both be thankful that there is some reason to prevent my trying." She bowed mockingly as he raised his hat. "I wish you well," he said, "and these are my last words to you." And he retired, not without distinction. He retired, shall we say, as conscious of his waist as if it were some poor soldier he was supporting from a stricken field. He said many things to himself on the way home, and he was many Tommies, but all with the same waist. It intruded on his noblest reflections, and kept ringing up the worst in him like some devil at the telephone. No one could have been more thankful that, on the whole, he had kept his passions in check. It made a strong man of him. It turned him into a joyous boy, and he tingled with hurrahs. Then suddenly he would hear that jeering bell clanging, "Too stout, too stout." "Take care!" he roared. Oh, the vanity of Tommy! He did not tell Grizel that he had met her ladyship. All she knew was that he came back to her more tender and kind, if that were possible, than he had gone away. His eyes followed her about the room until she made merry over it, and still they dwelt upon her. "How much more beautiful you are than any other woman I ever saw, Grizel," he said, and it was not only true, but he knew it was true. What was Lady Pippinworth beside this glorious woman? What was her damnable coldness compared to the love of Grizel? Was he unforgivable, or was it some flaw in the making of him for which he was not responsible? With clenched hands he asked himself these questions. This love that all his books were about, what was it? Was it a compromise between affection and passion countenanced by God for the continuance of the race, made beautiful by Him where the ingredients are in right proportion, a flower springing from a soil that is not all divine? Oh, so exquisite a flower, he cried, for he knew his Grizel. But he could not love her. He gave her all his affection, but his passion, like an outlaw, had ever to hunt alone. Was it that? And if it was, did there remain in him enough of humanity to give him the right to ask a little sympathy of those who can love? So Tommy, in his despairing moods, and the question ought to find some place in his epitaph, which, by the way, it is almost time to write. On the day following his meeting with Lady Pippinworth came a note from Lady Rintoul, inviting Grizel and him to lunch. They had been to Rintoul once or twice before, but this time Tommy said decisively, "We shan't go." He guessed who had prompted the invitation, though her name was not mentioned in it. "Why not?" Grizel asked. She was always afraid that she kept Tommy too much to herself. "Because I object to being disturbed during the honeymoon," he replied lightly. Their honeymoon, you know, was never to end. "They would separate us for hours, Grizel. Think of it! But pooh, the thing is not to be thought of. Tell her ladyship courteously that she must be mad." But though he could speak thus to Grizel, there came to him tempestuous desires to be by the side of the woman who could mock him and then stand waiting. Had she shown any fear of him, all would have been well with Tommy. He could have kept away from her complacently, but she had flung down the glove and laughed to see him edge away from it. He knew exactly what was in her mind. He was too clever not to know that her one desire was to make him a miserable man. To remember how he had subdued and left her would be gall to Lady Pippinworth until she achieved the same triumph over him. How confident she was that he could never prove the stronger of the two again! What were all her mockings but a beckoning to him to come on? "Take care," said Tommy between his teeth. And then again horror of himself would come to his rescue. The man he had been a moment ago was vile to him, and all his thoughts were now heroic. You may remember that he had once taken Grizel to a seaside place. They went there again. It was Tommy's proposal, but he did not go to flee from temptation. However, his worst nature had been stirred and his vanity pricked. He was too determinedly Grizel's to fear that in any fierce hour he might rush into danger. He wanted Grizel to come away from the place where she always found so much to do for him, so that there might be the more for him to do for her. And that week was as the time they had spent there before. All that devotion which had to be planned could do for woman he did. Grizel saw him planning it, and never admitted that she saw. In the after years it was sweet to her to recall that week, and the 100 laboriously lover-like things Tommy had done in it. She knew by this time that Tommy had never tried to make her love him, and that it was only when her love for him revealed itself in the den that desire to save her pride made him pretend to be in love with her. This knowledge would have been a great pain to her once, but now it had more of pleasure in it, for it showed that even in those days he had struggled a little for her. We must hasten to the end. Those of you who took in the newspapers a quarter of a century ago know what it was, but none of you know why he climbed the wall. They returned to Thrums in a week. They had meant to stay longer, but suddenly Tommy wanted to go back. Yes, it was Lady Pippinworth who recalled him, but don't think too meanly of Tommy. It was not that he yielded to one of those fierce desires to lift the gauntlet. He had got rid of them in fair fight when her letter reached him, forwarded from Thrums. "Did you really think your manuscript was lost?" it said. That was what took Tommy back. Grizel did not know the reason. He gave her another. He thought very little about her that day. He thought still less about Lady Pippinworth. How could he think of anything but it? She had it. Evidently she had it. She must have stolen it from his bag. He could not even spare time to denounce her. It was alive. His manuscript was alive, and every moment brought him nearer to it. He was a miser, and soon his hands would be deep among the gold. He was a mother whose son, mourned for dead, is knocking at the door. He was a swain, and his beloved's arms were outstretched to him. Who said that Tommy could not love? The ecstasies that came over him and would not let him sit still made Grizel wonder. "Is it a book?" she asked, and he said it was a book. Such a book, Grizel! When he started for the castle next morning, she thought he wanted to be alone to think of the book. "Of it and you," he said, and having started, he came back to kiss her again. He never forgot to have an impulse to do that. But all the way to the Spittal it was of his book he thought. It was his book he was kissing. His heart sang within him, and the songs were sonnets to his beloved. To be worthy of his beautiful manuscript, he prayed for that, as lovers do, that his love should be his alone, was as wondrous to him as to any of them. But we are not noticing what proved to be the chief thing. Though there was some sun, the air was shrewd, and he was wearing the old doctor's coat. Should you have taken it with you, Tommy? It loved Grizel, for it was a bit of him. And what, think you, would the old doctor have cared for your manuscript had he known that you were gone out to meet that woman? It was cruel, no, not cruel, but thoughtless to wear the old doctor's coat. He found no one at the Spittal. The men were out shooting, and the ladies had followed to lunch with them on the moors. He came upon them, a gay party, in the hollow of a hill where was a spring suddenly converted into a wine cellar. And soon the men, if not the ladies, were surprised to find that Tommy could be the gayest of them all. He was in hilarious spirits, and had a gallantly forgiving glance for the only one of them who knew why his spirits were hilarious. But he would not consent to remain to dinner. "The wretch is so hopelessly in love with his wife," Lady Rintoul said, flinging a twig of heather at him. It was one of the many trivial things said on that occasion, and long remembered. The only person who afterwards professed her inability to remember what Tommy said to her that day, and she to him, was Lady Pippinworth. "And yet you walked back to the castle with him," they reminded her. "If I had known that anything was to happen," she replied indolently, "I should have taken more note of what was said. But as it was, I think we talked of our chance of finding white heather. We were looking for it, and that is why we fell behind you." That was not why Tommy and her ladyship fell behind the others, and it was not of white heather that they talked. "You know why I am here, Alice," he said, as soon as there was no one but her to hear him. She was in as great tension at that moment as he, but more anxious not to show it. "Why do you call me that?" she replied with a little laugh. "Because I want you to know at once," he said, and it was the truth, "that I have no vindictive feelings. You have kept my manuscript from me all this time, but severe though the punishment has been, I deserved it. Yes, every day of it." Lady Pippinworth smiled. "You took it from my bag, did you not?" said Tommy. "Yes." "Where is it, Alice? Have you got it here?" "No." "But you know where it is?" "Oh, yes," she said graciously, and then it seemed that nothing could ever disturb him again. She enjoyed his boyish glee. She walked by his side, listening airily to it. "Had there been a fire in the room that day, I should have burned the thing," she said without emotion. "It would have been no more than my deserts," Tommy replied cheerfully. "I did burn it 3 months afterwards," she said calmly. He stopped, but she walked on. He sprang after her. "You don't mean that, Alice?" "I do mean it." With a gesture fierce and yet imploring, he compelled her to stop. "Before God, is this true?" he cried. "Yes," she said, "it is true." And indeed it was the truth about his manuscript at last. "But you had a copy of it made first. Say you had." "I had not." She seemed to have no fear of him, though his face was rather terrible. "I meant to destroy it from the first," she said coldly. but I was afraid to. I took it back with me to London. One day I read in a paper that your wife was supposed to have burned it while she was insane. She was insane, was she not? Ah, well, that is not my affair, but I burned it for her that afternoon." They were moving on again. He stopped her once more. "Why have you told me this?" he cried. "Was it not enough for you that I should think she did it?" "No," Lady Pippinworth answered, "that was not enough for me. I always wanted you to know that I had done it." "And you wrote that letter you filled me with joy, so that you should gloat over my disappointment?" "Horrid of me, was it not?" said she. "Why did you not tell me when we met the other day?" "I bided my time, as the tragedians say." "You would not have told me," Tommy said, staring into her face, "if you had thought I cared for you. Had you thought I cared for you a little jot?" "I should have waited," she confessed, "until you cared for me a great deal, and then I should have told you. That, I admit, was my intention." She had returned his gaze smilingly, and as she strolled on she gave him another smile over her shoulder. It became a protesting pout almost when she saw that he was not accompanying her. Tommy stood still for some minutes, his hands, his teeth, every bit of him that could close, tight clenched. When he made up on her, the devil was in him. She had been gathering a nosegay of wild flowers. "Pretty, are they not?" she said to him. He took hold of her harshly by both wrists. She let him do it, and stood waiting disdainfully, but she was less unprepared for a blow than for what came. "How you love me, Alice!" he said in a voice shaking with passion. "How I have proved it!" she replied promptly. "Love or hate," he went on in a torrent of words, "they are the same thing with you. I don't care what you call it. It has made you come back to me. You tried hard to stay away. How you fought, Alice! But you had to come. I knew you would come. All this time you have been longing for me to go to you. You have stamped your pretty feet because I did not go. You have cried, 'He shall come.' You have vowed you would not go one step of the way to meet me. I saw you. I heard you. And I wanted you as much as you wanted me, but I was always the stronger, and I could resist. It is I who have not gone a step toward you, and it is my proud little Alice who has come all the way. Proud little Alice, but she is to be my obedient little Alice now." His passion hurled him along, and it had its effect on her. She might curl her mouth as she chose, but her bosom rose and fell. "Obedient?" she cried with a laugh. "Obedient," said Tommy, quivering with his intensity. "Obedient not because I want it, for I prefer you as you are, but because you are longing for it, my lady, because it is what you came here for. You have been a virago only because you feared you were not to get it. Why have you grown so quiet, Alice? Where are the words you want to torment me with? Say them. I love to hear them from your lips. I love the demon in you, the demon that burned my book. I love you the more for that. It was your love that made you do it. Why don't you scratch and struggle for the last time? I am half sorry that little Alice is to scratch and struggle no more." "Go on," said little Alice. "You talk beautifully." But though her tongue could mock him, all the rest of her was enchained. "Whether I shall love you when you are tamed," he went on with vehemence, "I don't know. You must take the risk of that. But I love you now. We were made for one another, you and I love you, Alice. I love you, and you love me. You love me, my peerless Alice, don't you? Say you love me. Your melting eyes are saying it. How you tremble, sweet Alice. Is that your way of saying it? I want to hear you say it. You have been longing to say it for 2 years. Come, love, say it now." It was not within this woman's power to resist him. She tried to draw away from him, but could not. She was breathing quickly. The mocking light quivered on her face only because it had been there so long. If it went out, she would be helpless. He put his hands on her shoulders, and she was helpless. It brought her mouth nearer his. She was offering him her mouth. "No," said Tommy masterfully, "I won't kiss you until you say it." If there had not been a look of triumph in his eyes she would have said it. As it was, she broke from him, panting. She laughed next minute, and with that laugh his power fell among the heather. "Really," said Lady Pippinworth, "you are much too stout for this kind of thing." She looked him up and down with a comic sigh. "You talk as well as ever," she said condolingly, "but heigh-ho, you don't look the same. I have done the best I could for you, for the sake of old times, but I forgot to shut my eyes. Shall we go on?" And they went on silently, one of them very white. "I believe you are blaming me," her ladyship said, making a face just before they overtook the others, "when you know it was your own fault for," she suddenly rippled, "for not waiting until it was too dark for me to see you." They strolled with some others of the party to the flower garden, which was some distance from the house, and surrounded by a high wall studded with iron spikes and glass. Lady Rintoul cut him some flowers for Grizel, but he left them on a garden seat, accidentally, every one thought afterwards in the drawing-room when they were missed, but he had laid them down, because how could those degraded hands of his carry flowers again to Grizel? There was great remorse in him, but there was a shrieking vanity also, and though the one told him to be gone, the other kept him lagging on. They had torn him a dozen times from each other's arms before he was man enough to go. It was gloaming when he set off, waving his hat to those who had come to the door with him. Lady Pippinworth was not among them. He had not seen her to bid her good-bye, nor wanted to, for the better side of him had prevailed, so he thought. It was a man shame-stricken and determined to kill the devil in him that went down that long avenue, so he thought. A tall, thin woman was standing some 20 yards off, among some holly trees. She kissed her hand mockingly to him, and beckoned and laughed when he stood irresolute. He thought he heard her cry, "Too stout!" He took some fierce steps towards her. She ran on, looking over her shoulder, and he forgot all else and followed her. She darted into the flower garden, pulling the gate to after her. It was a gate that locked when it closed, and the key was gone. Lady Pippinworth clapped her hands because he could not reach her. When she saw that he was climbing the wall, she ran farther into the garden. He climbed the wall, but as he was descending, one of the iron spikes on the top of it pierced his coat, which was buttoned to the throat, and he hung there by the neck. He struggled as he choked, but he could not help himself. He was unable to cry out. The collar of the old doctor's coat held him fast. They say that in such a moment a man reviews all his past life. I don't know whether Tommy did that, but his last reflection before he passed into unconsciousness was, "Serves me right." Perhaps it was only a little bit of sentiment for the end. Lady Disdain came back to the gate by and by to see why he had not followed her. She screamed and then hid in the recesses of the garden. He had been dead for some time when they found him. They left the gate creaking in the evening wind. After a long time a terrified woman stole out by it. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Tommy and Grizel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie. Chapter 35 The Perfect Lover. Tommy has not lasted more than once since it became known that I was writing his life. I have been asked whether there ever really was such a person, and I am afraid to inquire for his books at the library, lest they are no longer there. A recent project to bring out a new edition, with introductions by some other Tommy, received so little support that it fell to the ground. It must be admitted that, so far as the great public is concerned, Thomas Sandys is done for. They have even forgotten the manner of his death, though probably no young writer with an eye on posterity ever had a better send-off. We really thought at the time that Tommy had found a way. The surmise at Rintoul, immediately accepted by the world as a fact, was that he had been climbing the wall to obtain for Grizel the flowers accidentally left in the garden, and it at once tipped the tragedy with gold. The newspapers, which were in the middle of the dull season, thanked their gods for Tommy, and enthusiastically set to work on him. Great minds wrote criticisms of what they called his life work. The many persons who had been the first to discover him said so again. His friends were in demand for the most trivial reminiscences. Unhappy Pym cleared £11 10s. Shall we quote? It is nearly always done at this stage of the biography, so now for the testimonials to prove that our hero was without a flaw. A few specimens will suffice if we select some that are very like many of the others. It keeps Grizel waiting, but Tommy, as you have seen, was always the great one. She existed only that he might show how great he was. Busy among us of late, says one, has been the grim visitor who knocks with equal confidence at the doors of the gifted and the ungifted, the pauper and the prince, and twice in one short month has he taken from us men of an eminence greater perhaps than that of Mr. Sandys. But of them it could be said their work was finished, while his sun sinks tragically when it is yet day. Not by what his riper years might have achieved can this pure spirit now be judged, and to us, we confess, there is something infinitely pathetic in that thought. We would fain shut our eyes and open them again at 20 years hence, with Mr. Sandys in the fullness of his powers. It is not to be. What he might have become is hidden from us. What he was we know. He was little more than a stripling when he burst upon the town to be its marvel and to die. A marvellous boy indeed, yet how unlike in character and in the nobility of his short life, as in the mournful yet lovely circumstances of his death, to that other might have been who perished in his pride. Our young men of letters have travelled far since the days of Chatterton. Time was when a riotous life was considered part of their calling, when they shunned the domestic ties and actually held that the consummate artist is able to love nothing but the creations of his fancy. It is such men as Thomas Sandys who have exploded that pernicious fallacy. Whether his name will march down the ages is not for us, his contemporaries, to determine. He had the most modest opinion of his own work, and was humbled rather than elated when he heard it praised. No one ever loved praise less. To be pointed at as a man of distinction was abhorrent to his shrinking nature. He seldom, indeed, knew that he was being pointed at, for his eyes were ever on the ground. He set no great store by the remarkable popularity of his works. Nothing, he has been heard to say to one of those gushing ladies who were his aversion, nothing will so certainly perish as the talk of the town. It may be so, but if so, the greater the pity that he has gone from among us before he had time to put the coping stone upon his work. There is a beautiful passage in one of his own books in which he sees the spirits of gallant youth who died too young for immortality haunting the portals of the Elysian fields, and the great shades come to the portal and talk with them. We venture to say that he is at least one of these. What was the individuality behind the work? They discussed it in leading articles and in the correspondence columns, and the man proved to be greater than his books. His distaste for admiration is again and again insisted on, and illustrated by many characteristic anecdotes. He owed much to his parents, though he had the misfortune to lose them when he was but a child. Little is known of his father, but we understand that he was a retired military officer in easy circumstances. The mother was a canny Scotchwoman of lowly birth, conspicuous for her devoutness even in a land where it is everyone's birthright, and on their marriage, which was a singularly happy one, they settled in London, going little into society, the world forgetting by the world forgot, and devoting themselves to each other and to their 2 children. Of these Thomas was the elder, and as the twig was early bent, so did the tree incline. From his earliest years he was noted for the modesty which those who remember his boyhood in Scotland, whither the children went to an uncle on the death of their parents, still speak of with glistening eyes. In another column will be found some interesting recollections of Mr. Sandys by his old schoolmaster, Mr. David Cathro, M.A., who testifies with natural pride to the industry and amiability of his famous pupil. To know him, says Mr. Cathro, was to love him. According to another authority, T. Sandys got his early modesty from his father, who was of a very sweet disposition, and some instances of this modesty are given. They are all things that Elspeth did, but Tommy is now represented as the person who had done them. On the other hand, his strong will, singleness of purpose, and enviable capacity for knowing what he wanted to be at were a heritage from his practical and sagacious mother. I think he was a little proud of his strength of will, writes the R.A., who painted his portrait, now in America, for I remember his anxiety that it should be suggested in the picture. But another acquaintance, a lady, replies he was not proud of his strong will, but he liked to hear it spoken of, and he once told me the reason. This strength of will was not, as is generally supposed, inherited by him. He was born without it, and acquired it by a tremendous effort. I believe I am the only person to whom he confided this, for he shrank from talk about himself, looking upon it as a form of that sentimentality which his soul abhorred. He seems often to have warned ladies against this essentially womanish tendency to the sentimental. "It is an odious onion, dear lady," he would say, holding both her hands in his. If men in his presence talked sentimentally to ladies, he was so irritated that he soon found a pretext for leaving the room. Yet let it not be thought, says one who knew him well, that because he was so sternly practical himself, he was intolerant of the outpourings of the sentimental. The man, in short, reflected the views on this subject which are so admirably phrased in his books, works that seem to me to found one of their chief claims to distinction on this, that at last we have a writer who can treat intimately of human love without leaving one smear of the onion upon his pages. On the whole, it may be noticed, comparatively few ladies contribute to the obituary reflections, for the simple reason, says a simple man, that he went but little into female society. He who could write so eloquently about women never seemed to know what to say to them. Ordinary tittle-tattle from them disappointed him. I should say that to him there was so much of the divine in women that he was depressed when they hid their wings. This view is supported by Clubman, who notes that Tommy would never join in the somewhat free talk about the other sex in which many men indulge. I remember, he says, a man's dinner at which 2 of those present, both persons of eminence, started a theory that every man who is blessed or cursed with the artistic instinct has at some period of his life wanted to marry a barmaid. Mr. Sandys gave them such a look that they at once apologized. Trivial, perhaps, but significant. On another occasion I was in a club smoking room when the talk was of a similar kind. Mr. Sandys was not present. A member said with a laugh, "I wonder for how long men can be together without talking gamesomely of women." Before any answer could be given, Mr. Sandys strolled in, and immediately the atmosphere cleared as if someone had opened the windows. When he had gone, the member addressed turned to him who had propounded the problem, and said, "There is your answer, as long as Sandys is in the room." "A fitting epitaph this for Thomas Sandys," says the paper that quotes it, "if we could not find a better. Mr. Sandys was from first to last a man of character, but why, when others falter, was he always so sure-footed? It is in the answer to this question that we find the key to the books, and to the man who was greater than the books. He was the perfect lover. As he died seeking flowers for her who had the high honour to be his wife, so he had always lived. He gave his affection to her, as our correspondent, Miss or Mrs. Ailie MacLean, shows, in his earliest boyhood, and from this his one romance he never swerved. To the moment of his death all his beautiful thoughts were flowers plucked for her. His books were bunches of them gathered to place at her feet. No harm now in reading between the lines of his books, and culling what is the common knowledge of his friends in the North, that he had to serve a long apprenticeship before he won her. For long his attachment was unreciprocated, though she was ever his loyal friend, and the volume called Unrequited Love belongs to the period when he thought his life must be lived alone. The circumstances of their marriage are at once too beautiful and too painful to be dwelt on here. Enough to say that should the particulars ever be given to the world with the simple story of his life, a finer memorial will have been raised to him than anything in stone, such as we see a committee is already being formed to erect. We venture to propose as a title for his biography, "The Story of the Perfect Lover." Yes, that memorial committee was formed, but so soon do people forget the hero of yesterday's paper that only the secretary attended the first meeting, and he never called another. But here, 25 years later, is the biography, with the title changed. You may wonder that I had the heart to write it. I do it, I have sometimes pretended to myself, that we may all laugh at the stripling of a rogue, but that was never my reason. Have I been too cunning, or have you seen through me all the time? Have you discovered that I was really pitying the boy who was so fond of boyhood that he could not with years become a man, telling nothing about him that was not true, but doing it with unnecessary scorn, in the hope that I might goad you into crying, "Come, come, you are too hard on him"? Perhaps the manner in which he went to his death deprives him of these words. Had the castle gone on fire that day while he was at tea, and he perished in the flames in a splendid attempt to save the life of his enemy, a very probable thing, then you might have felt a little liking for him. Yet he would have been precisely the same person. I don't blame you, but you are a Tommy. Grizel knew how he died. She found Lady Pippinworth's letter to him, and understood who the woman was, but it was only in hopes of obtaining the lost manuscript that she went to see her. Then Lady Pippinworth told her all. Are you sorry that Grizel knew? I am not sorry, I am glad. As a child, as a girl, and as a wife, the truth had been all she wanted, and she wanted it just the same when she was a widow. We have a right to know the truth, no right to ask anything else from God, but the right to ask that. And to her latest breath she went on loving Tommy just the same. She thought everything out calmly for herself. She saw that there is no great man on this earth except the man who conquers self, and that in some the accursed thing which is in all of us may be so strong that to battle with it and be beaten is not altogether to fail. It is foolish to demand complete success of those we want to love. we should rejoice when they rise for a moment above themselves, and sympathize with them when they fall. In their heyday, young lovers think each other perfect, but a nobler love comes when they see the failings also, and this higher love is so much more worth attaining to that they need not cry out, though it has to be beaten into them with rods. So they learn humanity's limitations, and that the accursed thing to me is not the accursed thing to you, but all have it, and from this comes pity for those who have sinned, and the desire to help each other springs. For knowledge is sympathy, and sympathy is love, and to learn it the Son of God became a man. And Grizel also thought anxiously about herself, and how from the time when she was the smallest girl she had longed to be a good woman, and feared that perhaps she never should. And as she looked back at the road she had travelled, there came along it the little girl to judge her. She came trembling, but determined to know the truth, and she looked at Grizel until she saw into her soul, and then she smiled, well pleased. Grizel lived on at Double Dykes, helping David in the old way. She was too strong and fine a nature to succumb. Even her brightness came back to her. They sometimes wondered at the serenity of her face. Some still thought her a little standoffish, for, though the pride had gone from her walk, a distinction of manner grew upon her and made her seem a finer lady than before. There was no other noticeable change, except that with the years she lost her beautiful contours and became a little angular, the old maid's figure, I believe it is sometimes called. No one would have dared to smile at Grizel become an old maid before some of the young men of Thrums. They were people who would have suffered much for her, and all because she had the courage to talk to them of some things before their marriage day came round, and for their young wives who had tidings to whisper to her about the unborn, she had the pretty idea that they should live with beautiful thoughts, so that these might become part of the child. When Gavinia told this to Corp, he gulped and said, "I wonder God could hae in the heart." "Life's a queerer thing," Gavinia replied, sadly enough, "than we used to think it when we was bairns in the Den." He spoke of it to Grizel. She let Corp speak of anything to her, because he was so loyal to Tommy. "You've given away a' your bonny things, Grizel," he said, "one by one, and this notion is the bonniest o' them a'. I'm thinking that when it cam into your head you meant it for yoursel." Grizel smiled at him. "I mind," Corp went on, "how when you was little you couldna see a bairn without rocking your arms in a waeful kind o' a way, and we could never thole the meaning o't. It just comes over me this minute as it meant that when you was a woman you would like terrible to hae bairns o' your ain, and you doubted you never should." She raised her hand to stop him. "You see, I was not meant to have them, Corp," she said. "I think that when women are too fond of other people's babies they never have any of their own." But Corp shook his head. "I didna understand it," he told her, "but I'm sure you was meant to hae them. Something's gane wrang." She was still smiling at him, but her eyes were wet now, and she drew him on to talk of the days when Tommy was a boy. It was sweet to Grizel to listen while Elspeth and David told her of the thousand things Tommy had done for her when she was ill, but she loved best to talk with Corp of the time when they were all children in the Den. The days of childhood are the best. She lived so long after Tommy that she was almost a middle-aged woman when she died, and so the Painted Lady's daughter has found a way of making Tommy's life the story of a perfect lover after all. The little girl she had been comes stealing back into the book and rocks her arms joyfully, and we see Grizel's crooked smile for the last time. End of chapter 35. End of Tommy and Grizel by J. M. Barrie.